Emotional resilience. If you lived honestly, your life would heal itself. As I look back on 3 decades helping patients cope with stress and understand their disappointments, this statement stands out as a singular truth. In nearly all the therapeutic breakthroughs I have seen, it was the acceptance of some previously concealed truth that allowed healing to begin. The principal directive of psychotherapy was to help the patient become more truthful about his feelings. Being a therapist was a lot like being a choreographer of emotions. Relating a vague or troublesome feeling to the event that caused it placed the emotion in perspective and made sense of it. No matter how complicated the emotion or how confusing the situation, the simplest truth usually made the biggest difference. When a person lost someone close to them, it was the truthful acceptance of that painful loss that initiated the mourning process and led to relief. The essence of family therapy came down to helping raise the level of truth in the communication between family members. That higher standard of truth healed the fractured love when it could be healed, or when it could not, it gave family members the courage to believe in themselves, take responsibility, and survive independently. Similarly, the goal of couple therapy was to get partners to reveal how they really felt about each other. No meaningful gains could be made until partners arrived at the same level of understanding. More than anything else, a marriage failed or succeeded depending on how much truth the partners could tell or hear. On the other hand, the smallest lie could defeat trust, create suspicion, and block the expression of love. Only when the partners expressed their true feelings, no matter how unpleasant, could the relationship begin to right itself. Resolving anxiety required that patients examine some painful truth that they had pushed aside. Dealing directly with the old problem allowed them to live in the moment again with confidence, rather than dreading that a nameless terror might at any moment be mysteriously activated and paralyze them. Healing depression also required that patients candidly admit some old hurt. This allowed them to understand that the anger they were trying to conceal came from their being injured, not because they were bad. Truthfully accepting hurt and anger resolved guilt and allowed patients to forgive themselves and others. Only then did depression begin to lift. Overcoming addictions, whether drug, alcohol, gambling, or overeating, always required accepting and living in a greater truthfulness. At the heart of every addiction was an anesthetized old hurt seeking to be released. Some chemical or self-destructive behavior reinforced the lie and made it more difficult to correct. Accepting the painful truth, rather than running from it, was the beginning of sobriety. Nothing less succeeded. It became clear that resolving most of life's difficulties required telling or hearing the truth. When a friendship went sour, it was usually because of a misunderstanding, a distortion of the facts. When people struggled with their parents or children, it was largely because of the distortions that had been allowed to establish themselves between them. What family members sought was to be clearly understood. People's greatest regrets involved wishing they'd had the chance to tell the truth so someone could have known how they really felt. When people said it was too late, what they really meant was that it was too late to tell the truth. The truth had power to heal, to protect, to guide. Living in the truth was living free and at one's best. On the other hand, living in a lie eclipsed the joy of the world and lowered people's self-esteem. Concealing lies drained people's energy so they didn't have enough strength to do their best. It was harder to look out for themselves. When people lived in a lie, they seemed to invite trouble into their life rather than make it better. Lies complicated, the truth simplified. An obvious question presented itself. Why was telling the truth so powerful? In my practice, I pondered this question and sought to take advantage of the truth's healing power. I realized my patients forgot most of what took place during therapy sessions, and I began to tape them so patients could replay them in private. I expected they would benefit from hearing my advice and comments again, since I could seldom remember exactly what I had said when asked to repeat, and felt my original wording was often the most effective. This led to an unexpected discovery. Many patients soon began telling me that they were troubled by what they had heard on the tape. Some said they disliked the sound of their voice. Others said the session became too painful to listen to. Eventually, the real reason for the aversion became clear. Patients could not stand listening to themselves distort the truth or misrepresent themselves. They cringed hearing the way they sounded when they lied. They seemed like less of a person, a child, like someone living in a dream world, and it bothered them. What stressed them the most, however, was the truth they sensed hidden just below their lies, which was struggling to be released. Approaching this concealed truth made my patients increasingly uncomfortable. They yearned to know it, but they were afraid of what they would discover. It was a turning point for many of them. Some were strongly motivated by their discomfort and eagerly embraced the fearful truth. They had to know. It was as if hearing themselves lie activated the displeasure of a higher, more spiritual self within that could no longer tolerate deception. They seemed to have found their healing self, and when they did, a natural process of recovery began. I tried to reinforce this natural process. I designed an exercise asking patients to replay the tape of their session and write down every lie they heard themselves tell. Then I asked them to correct the false statement. Finally, I asked them to explain the difference between the two statements. Did they wish to avoid something painful? Did they wish life were better? Were they hoping for the impossible? In a sense, the exercise was a method for helping patients tell the truth about their lies. And it worked. Making these corrections made it possible for patients to listen to their tape again and progress rapidly. Patients began to recognize not only the lies they told, but also their style of distorting. They began to put aside their denial and pretense and look at their hidden feelings, needs, and desires. They were able to stop making excuses and admit that their life had not turned out the way they wanted. Most importantly, they were willing to take responsibility for their role in their problems instead of blaming others. Reaching this new level of honesty released a surge of positive feelings and motivated patients to work harder. Facing and accepting the truth created a momentum of healing. It was as if the more truth they told, the more powerfully their healing self manifested in their lives. I was witnessing the wholesale release of a powerful healing process that I had only speculated on before when I was a resident in training. I remembered some of the questions I'd wondered about then. When, why, and how do people get better? I felt those questions were beginning to be answered. The healing process seemed so spontaneous that I called it natural therapy. I sought to define this process through a series of therapeutic workbooks that I had my patients use to facilitate their healing. I began to ask how this process worked, what got in its way, what happened when it was blocked, and what could be done to release it. This led me to study human emotions and to define the feeling cycle. I realized that the name given a painful feeling depended on when the pain occurred. Pain in the future was called anxiety. Pain in the present was called hurt and experienced as sadness or disappointment. Finally, pain in the past was called anger. When a person held in his anger, it became turned on himself and was experienced as guilt. Depression was the depletion of energy from holding anger inside. When I analyzed the forces that kept these feelings hidden, I discovered that the same defenses that blocked feelings also blocked people from knowing or telling the truth. I found that all defense mechanisms belong to three major defensive types: denial, blaming or excuses, and pretenses. I also realized that everyone used all of these defenses depending on the kind of pain they were defending and their personality type. This led me to define personality types by the way each person avoided pain during different stages of childhood. Thus, the dependent character was sensitive to the loss of love and used denial to protect himself. The controlling character blamed or made excuses when his power was threatened. Finally, the competitive person pretended not to care when he failed. Most people seemed a mixture of all three personality types and defenses. I began to define the dynamics of the natural therapeutic process. When a feeling was not expressed, it created a condition of tension. Emotional stress was simply the pressure of an unexpressed feeling. I called the condition of withholding feelings emotional debt. Put simply, you owe the expression of a hidden feeling. When you are in emotional debt, you suffer because you're afraid to tell the truth about your feelings. After a while, your defenses become more rigid, and it is increasingly more difficult to recall the truth. Your withheld feelings distort your life and consume your energy. There was no such thing as emotional credit. Although the more honest a person was, the more resilient he became, and the easier it was for him to endure stress. 2 points became clear. Emotional illness was a storage disease. The secret of mental health was to tell the person who hurt you that they hurt you when they hurt you. I then turned my attention to the study of the positive side of the feeling cycle, seeking to define how the various character types and defenses interfere with the experience of pleasure. I became aware of an intrusive phenomenon I had always before been familiar with, but never really recognized as a distinct mental process. Like all psychiatrists, I had often heard patients report how some trigger mysteriously caused old feelings to reappear as if out of nowhere, ruining their good times by paralyzing them with fear or filling them with anger or unresolved hurt. I reasoned that the source of these intrusive emotions had to be feelings that were stored in emotional debt. When these old feelings and attitudes were suddenly precipitated, it was as if a prefabricated mental state had suddenly been superimposed on the present. I called this intrusion toxic nostalgia and sought to understand and define its dynamics. Although they created a lot of problems when they escaped, the old emotions released as toxic nostalgia were just attempting to be resolved. It became clear that the amount of stored feelings and emotional debt determined your potential for toxic nostalgia. It followed from this that any effective therapy had to decrease the volume of old stored feelings and also prevent newer feelings from being withheld. Storing feelings by not expressing them in a timely fashion is the mechanism by which you become emotionally damaged. Toxic nostalgia defined the way these repressed feelings resurface in order to be addressed and finally put to rest. It was clear that toxic nostalgia was the most important element in the natural healing process, and studying it became the focus of my work. The natural healing process is always working within you. It helps you resolve your emotional as well as physical pain. Every wise physician knows that the best he can do for a patient is to assist nature in healing. The natural process always knows best. Before there were psychotherapists and physicians, this natural therapeutic process intuitively guided people through their problems to heal their pain and free them from the past. The heart of this process involved dealing honestly with life's problems by taking feelings and events at face value as they occurred. Facing life directly led to resolution of the problems that could be solved and acceptance of those that could not. This same healing process is already working within you. The best therapists help you get out of its way so it can do its job. If you acted with total honesty, expressing your true feelings to the person who most needs to hear them, you would be doing your part. The benefits you would receive are peace of mind, enduring health, and comfort with yourself just as you are. You would also age slowly because the energy used to confine emotions would be free to heal you and keep you young instead. This audiobook is designed to awaken you to the ancient knowledge that is within you. It will show you how to get out of your own way and allow this powerful healing process to function. It will teach you how to make toxic nostalgia work for you. Telling the truth, it's the easiest instruction to understand, the most difficult hurdle to leap, but it results in the greatest relief you can know. While complex emotions can be reduced to a simple formula, simple emotions can seem incomprehensible when you are personally embroiled in your own difficulties. When you hold on to a painful feeling rather than express it spontaneously, you begin to distort it. The longer the feeling is stored, the more distorted it tends to become. While the event which caused the original injury is probably a discrete incident, storing the feeling is likely to make your recollection blurry. For example, even though a person might have been terrified when he was lost in an amusement park when he was 5 years old, he'd find it difficult today to recall the exact emotions he'd felt. He might be able to remember some facts, but the memory of his old feelings has become altered both by recent history and the opinions he later formed about the event. He may have found being lost so uncomfortable that now he finds it difficult to remember any feelings and hardly remembers the incident. Most likely, being lost was a hurt that was allowed to heal. He learned to trust his parents again and realized that being lost was just a mistake. He was not being abandoned. On the other hand, imagine that the person who was lost in the amusement park came from a home where he'd suffered serious neglect. His retelling of being lost in the amusement park would likely include some of his other unexpressed old hurts, some of which were too vague to be remembered. The incident of being lost would become a symbol for being neglected, and the emotion he felt would be exaggerated in support of his belief. In this way, the memory of a painful event can stand for many stored feelings. Hidden feelings are always trying to make a case in exactly this way. When you are hurt and retain the feeling, the hurt is converted into anger and the anger grows. Your mind continually collects other examples of your being hurt to justify your feeling angry. To feel angry without knowing why is extremely disruptive. Eventually, you turn the anger against yourself and begin to doubt your goodness. After all, if you can be this angry for no reason, you begin to wonder if you might be a bad person. This dilemma causes depressed people to suffer. When your mind searches forwards and backwards trying to justify your anger, the hurtful memory you locate is likely to be distorted, contaminated by many feelings. A story that made headlines a few years ago illustrates the extent to which reasoning can be distorted by stored pain. An old widower, reclusive after the death of his wife, was annoyed by some boys who stole apples from his orchard. When the boys ignored his warnings, the old man shot into the trees and killed 2 of them. As he was taken away, he explained pitifully, "But I warned them," as if that were enough to justify his actions. Obviously, he had so rationalized his actions in his own mind that he had lost touch with reality. Although this example is extreme, it reflects how all feelings stored in emotional debt undergo distortion. As new hurts are held in, they are combined with the old, adding to the pressure and the potential for toxic nostalgia. If the feelings are allowed to build to intolerable levels, they can be triggered by a symbolic emotional event and be released without sufficient consideration of the consequences, as in this tragic case. The old man felt robbed because fate stole his wife from him. When the boys stole his apples, they reawakened the feelings of outrage and powerlessness that he had when his wife died. He was highly charged to protect himself from the next robbery and to avenge the old one by proxy. In order to unlock the mystery of toxic nostalgia, the most effective psychotherapists guide patients to understand the meaning of their hidden feelings. The realization they seek to liberate in their patients is, "Aha! Now I know what has happened to me." The following case illustrates many of the features of toxic nostalgia and emotional debt. Suzanne was a school teacher in her late 30s who sought help for debilitating anxiety attacks that had plagued her for almost 20 years. Her problem first began as a fear of riding in elevators and then expanded to a fear of going into any enclosed space. Therapy and medication, which had been directed at helping her cope with her symptoms, had only been marginally helpful. When asked to recall her first episode of panic, Suzanne immediately protested that she couldn't remember. After persistent questioning, she finally blurted, "It was in Chicago, at the Empire State Building." On hearing herself speak these words, Suzanne became aware she'd made a mistake and corrected it, saying that it must have been at the Sears Tower in Chicago. Then, on reflection, she realized that her only visit to Chicago was many years after her symptoms started. In a sense, Suzanne felt that to cause her such severe symptoms, the elevator in question had to be in one of the tallest buildings in the world, an example of how stored-up feelings shape your recollection of events. Suzanne finally remembered that the elevator in which she had had her first anxiety attack was a short one indeed, only 3 stories. It was located in a restaurant where she was going to lunch with her sister and her parents. It was pointed out that the elevator ride must have seemed to her as if it were taking forever, making the building seem much taller. On hearing this explanation, a feeling of being trapped returned, and with it, some additional memories. Suzanne recalled that at the time of the first attack, she was 19 and had just finished her first year in college, which she considered the worst year of her life. She had desperately wanted to pursue a dancing career, but her mother insisted she qualify as a teacher to protect her options. The implication was clear. Mother did not believe Suzanne had enough talent to have a successful dance career. Suzanne was hurt, but meekly acquiesced. Suzanne was deeply disappointed in school and barely managed to make passing grades. Because she spent so little time dancing, her performance began to slip, and she began to doubt her talent. It also made Mother's opinion seem like prophecy, and her advice to have an alternate career a wise assessment. Suzanne's parents were both artists and familiar with the world of performance. They had for a long time been determined to persuade Suzanne's younger sister Kim to become a cello soloist. Ironically, Kim did not want to be a soloist because the pressure was so intense. So while the parents did not believe in Suzanne at all, they believed in her sister, and to an excessive degree. This only added to Suzanne's frustration and hurt. When Mother and Father made plans for the lunch, it was clear that they had two main points on their agenda. They wanted to convince Suzanne to complete her teaching accreditation and give up her dancing career, and coax Kim to become a soloist. As they all drove to the restaurant, Suzanne mentally rehearsed her plea to study dance. But when she searched for evidence to prove that she had talent, she had only the past miserable year to fall back on. Her former achievements now seemed distant and unconvincing, and her low self-esteem made it easy for her to discount them. Kim, however, was already arguing with Mother. Suzanne began to get increasingly uncomfortable listening to Kim express herself. Suzanne wished she could express her feelings as directly, but feared she would lose control. Walking to the restaurant, Kim became sarcastic and bitter. Mother gave her an inhibiting glare, but Kim bravely persisted. Suzanne remembered how Mother's look had always silenced her when she was a child. She'd always given in and never protested. Suzanne suddenly hated herself for being so weak. She wanted to express herself as well. Suzanne's resentment increased as they waited for the elevator. She was about to tell Mother how she really felt when the elevator door opened. She decided to say nothing and stepped inside, silencing the long repressed words of defiance just as they finally had come to her lips. As she did, the elevator door closed with a thud. Suddenly, Suzanne felt trapped within the elevator and within herself. A fear came over her and grew into a suffocating dread. She became dizzy and frightened as her heart started to pound. She felt she would burst. She ached desperately to be free of her confinement in the elevator and from confining her explosive anger. By the time the elevator reached the restaurant, Suzanne was in an uncontrollable panic, convinced that her surfacing feelings were caused by riding in the elevator, a much more acceptable belief than admitting she was angry at her parents and feared losing their approval and love if they found out. Because Suzanne's anger had never come so close to the surface, she never before knew just how angry she had been, and this realization undermined her self-esteem. She felt as if for a dark moment her secret had made itself visible, and this convinced her she was bad. It is when an unacceptable feeling is repressed that the symbolic emotional trigger is selected and invested with its disruptive power. Suzanne was never particularly fearful about elevators until she associated her fear of losing control to them. Had she been sitting at the table in the restaurant holding a knife at the time she repressed those very same emotions, she could equally have developed a terror of sharp objects, fearing she would take a knife and hurt someone. When the trigger is separated from the inhibited emotions that it comes to symbolize, it becomes a mystery of its own. No one expresses his feelings completely in the moment they occur, and therefore everyone stores some emotions. Your capacity for toxic nostalgia depends on many factors: how many feelings you have concealed, how much you fear expressing them, your openness, your fatigue, and your honesty, just to mention a few. What follows is an explanation of the natural therapeutic process and a plan to use the special opening created by toxic nostalgia to your advantage. The cardinal principles of natural therapy are: respect yourself. Face the truth even if it hurts. Identify your feelings. Express them to the person who inspired them. Be prompt, don't wait for ideal conditions. Be simple, long explanations are unnecessary. If the other person hears you, you have succeeded. If he refuses to hear, understand whom you're dealing with. Be willing to accept the situation as it is. Let go of your hurt and forgive. Move on. Taking responsibility for your feelings and where you are in your life is a vital part of the natural healing process. No matter how much Suzanne might feel her mother had hurt her, it was Suzanne's job to speak up. To do this, she needed to believe in herself and risk losing mother's love by expressing her feelings. Sometimes it takes a lot of pain for a person to get to that place. No matter how badly someone hurts you, it's always your responsibility to stand up and defend yourself. You must take responsibility for tolerating being treated the way you are, for accepting a life that doesn't make you happy, for living with the addict or the alcoholic, for failing in your career or relationship, for your mistakes, especially the ones that repeat, for remaining silent in the face of injustice, for not speaking out, for holding on to your pain, for not forgiving and choosing to suffer instead, for being the way you are, where you are. It may seem difficult and unfair, but if you take responsibility for everything in your life, you claim the... This natural therapeutic process is also concerned with helping you find yourself. It forces you to examine your discontent, to ponder your purpose, and so it directs you to seek fulfillment. Thus, this process has two distinct goals: motivating you to become emotionally free and encouraging you to discover and develop your true talent. What's the point of becoming emotionally free if you're not going to do something meaningful with your life, something that matters to you? Just as gravity pulls water, there is a natural direction to this process, a momentum which inclines you towards emotional health and spiritual growth. That process leads you to see and confront your self-deceptions and acknowledge your unhappiness. Only then can you deal with them and move on. If you fear accepting your feelings or deny what has happened to you, you are forced to bear the burden of holding back the inevitable. When these old emotions flood into the present, they can wash away your emotional fortifications, causing great upheaval. At the same time, it is only when your defensive barriers are lifted that the healing process is free to do its work. Facing your discontent heals you. The natural therapeutic process directs you to express your feelings, to mourn, forgive, and heal, to admit the lies you tell, to understand why you tell them, to understand your true needs, to give up false expectations, to accept yourself just as you are, to create your own life, free, productive, and happy. Do not lament any part of your life. Every hardship can teach you a valuable lesson. Every problem you encounter is partly the result of something in your past you previously did not understand, did not take responsibility for, or wished to ignore. You must sometimes endure a life of pain before you are ready to admit what everyone else can plainly see. The forces that finally drag you to the bottom are usually of your own creation. The very barriers you erected to protect yourself become too costly and too emotionally exhausting to maintain. Your life becomes consumed by the empty activities and meaningless rituals and symbols you invent to hide from disappointment. Your attempt to protect yourself becomes your undoing. Eventually, there comes a day of awakening and reckoning. Your epiphany is both inevitable and totally unexpected. It is often triggered by a trivial detail that somehow slipped past your defenses. In the moment of your illumination, you finally see yourself as you are and are forced to surrender to the truth, lest your false illusions forever obscure your best chances for happiness. Stanford, a prominent physician who always bragged about his loving marriage, began to have compulsive affairs that left him confused and torn with guilt. He really wanted to be faithful to his wife and was certain that they loved each other, but he could not explain why he was unfaithful and refused to admit that his marriage was in any trouble. Stanford had built an extravagant beach home that was way beyond his means, and he held it up to the world as proof of his marriage's stability. When Stanford's wife discovered his affairs, she shocked him by refusing to discuss reconciliation and taking immediate steps to get a divorce. Deeply wounded, and yet unable to grasp that he was rejected, Stanford insisted on keeping the beach house as his part of the settlement. It was an unaffordable excess he couldn't let go because it was an extension of his denial. Keeping the house allowed him to hold on to his belief that his wife had loved him. One weekend after his painful divorce, Stanford went down to the shore to enjoy his retreat, his symbol of happiness. As he paced on the spacious veranda, surveying Nantucket Sound in the nippy early spring air, the place seemed anything but a consolation. He began to think of his marriage and why he built the home in the first place. He remembered how he made the architect crazy with all his changes, insisting that everything be just right. His old critical attitude reawakened, he began to scrutinize the porch. He noticed that one of the shutters was crooked and had been improperly mounted. He became irritated. When he tried to adjust it, he found that it had only been painted on one side. Suddenly he felt cheated. A swell of anger built up in him, and he began to curse the contractor, when just as abruptly he became weak and dizzy. He slumped back into a wooden deck chair and began to weep as the feeling he refused to recognize flooded over him. Discovering that the shutter only appeared perfect on the surface, but was flawed when he examined it closely, pierced his pretense. He realized for the first time that he had created the perfect place to conceal the fact that his marriage was lacking love. The awareness came unexpectedly, precipitated by a tiny detail that suggested to him that he had also been maintaining a false facade. It was the first time Stanford allowed himself to feel sad about being deprived of affection. Acknowledging that his wife had not loved him for some time justified his hidden resentment and made perfect sense of his having an affair. He wasn't just a bad boy cheating on his perfect wife. He was lonely and desperate for love. He wasn't proud of cheating, but at least now he understood why he did it. It helped him believe in his goodness again. To be free of emotional debt, you need to express your hurt as it occurs. Expressing hurtful feelings should, with limited exceptions, be restricted to your friends and loved ones. You may feel tempted to express hurt outside your intimate circle, but doing so usually complicates situations, provokes people who have no interest in trying to understand you or in being patient or kind, and can be entirely inappropriate, especially in a business setting. So, how should you express your pain? Simply, say that you have been hurt in a way that makes your pain known. Directly, tell the person who caused it. Openly, don't conceal it, deny it, pretend it did not matter. Vulnerably, don't punish others or start a fight just to show you're tough. You were hurt, say so, it's more effective. Without fear, whatever the other person will do to you when you tell them you are hurt cannot be your concern. Expressing your hurt is your only business. Don't let your fear of rejection silence you. Honestly, separate the pain of the present from the pain of the past. Stay in the present moment, the present hurt, the present situation. Do not go into the negative history between you and the other person, citing prior damage or insensitivity. It will be seen as hurtful, paint you as someone bearing a grudge, and weaken your case. Finish your complaint and let go. Letting go of your hurt opens the gateway to acceptance, the object of the mourning process. You release your hurts to diminish your burden so you can live freely in the present. Everything known about human behavior testifies to this natural inclination to express and release feelings. Every society ritualizes funerals and losses in order to facilitate this outward expression of grief. You cannot correct or alter what has been done to you. It has happened, and that is that. You need to release your pain. You need to forgive the people who hurt you. The object of the natural therapeutic process is to place the losses you suffer in a healing perspective. The most important rule is to express your pain in the moment it occurs. However, it is not always possible to do this completely. Some pain gets trapped. The natural therapeutic process helps you sort out your emotional past and release your trapped pain. The following well-known emotional outlets help express and resolve emotions. The great physician Sir William Osler once said that the hurt that does not find its expression in tears may cause other organs to weep. Having a good cry is a cathartic experience, while inhibiting tears causes stress. To prove this, you need only go to a sad movie and swallow the lumps in your throat instead of giving into your tears. Holding back tears is painful, causes muscle tension and chest discomfort. In a word, inhibiting tears makes you sick. Protestation also plays an important role in the natural therapeutic process. Protesting is standing up for yourself. It is defending your beliefs, your boundaries. It is a declaration that you will not permit trespass. The purpose of displaying anger when you are hurt is to define the limits of your toleration and make your point with force so that no one will mistake your intentions. It is an affirmation of strength and survival. In spite of what you might have been taught, there is great therapeutic value in protesting when someone you love has hurt you. Dreaming is another critical component of your emotional well-being, not just because dreams help you stay asleep and get adequate rest. Dreams help you process those emotions of the day that you did not completely settle. If you suffered severe sleep deprivation and did not dream, your emotional health would become fragile. Children, especially newborns, dream extensively as if their dreams compensate for their lack of verbal ability to express themselves. You process a considerable bulk of your daily emotional responses in your dreams, greatly reducing the amount of emotions that you would otherwise have to store in emotional debt. Obviously, merely dreaming about a painful event isn't all that is needed to resolve it. The most important function of dreaming is to bring set-aside emotions to your attention again. To make the best use of your dreams, use them to recognize emotions you may have avoided. In order to understand the feelings you encounter in your dreams, try to relate them to real events in your life. Relief is also a central part of the healing process. Feeling relief does not necessarily mean all negative feelings have been resolved. Feeling relief only indicates that the pain has for the moment subsided and that you have come to more acceptable terms with it and yourself. Relief grants you a more truthful perspective. Often you don't know how much something means to you until you lose it. If somehow you are granted a second chance and what you thought you lost is returned to you, the relief you feel measures its worth to you. When the danger is past, it is safe to admit your fear. It is for this reason that people who act tough in the face of peril find it easier to show their fears at happy occasions. Think of soldiers and their families reuniting after a war. In some way, relief is the truest of feelings. In terms of the natural therapeutic process, the best use of relief is to allow it to help you define what really matters to you. Then you are better able to protect and value what you love. Laughter is an important adjunct to the natural therapeutic process. Where a dream may buoy up an old, painful feeling to the surface so that it becomes accessible to healing, laughter inserts the healing perspective in the middle of pain and allows you to see yourself from a new point of view. It is always striking how laughter can act as a positive force, releasing you from denial and allowing you to take yourself less seriously. When you laugh, you trigger relief. Some people who are trying their best to stay sad seem resentful when someone makes them laugh. It is as if the ability to laugh, by involuntarily accessing the perspective of healing, confers the belief that things are not so bad and undermines self-pity and self-destructiveness. It is often said that time heals all wounds. Time helps by putting distance between you and a terrible experience, making the danger seem farther away, giving you room to gather your senses so you can place the loss in perspective. Over time, you find the courage to review what happened to you, take stock of the damages you suffered, and make adjustments. Although many wounds never heal fully, they still need to be placed in perspective. It is also helpful to observe yourself from a distance to get a more truthful perspective of your disappointments. To see today's events in perspective, imagine you are 20 or 30 years older looking back on this moment. While you don't know how it all turned out, believe that one day you will be able to look back on today from a place of being healed. So, answer the following questions about your present disappointment from that point of view. Why did you think what you lost was so important to you? How much did you exaggerate its worth? Did you need a consuming love just to believe you were lovable? Did you need power to make you feel strong? Did you need the applause of others to prove your worth? What were you dependent upon and why? What were you trying to control and how? What were you pretending to be? Why didn't you accept yourself? How did you survive this loss? How much did you want or love what you lost? Why weren't you more careful, caring, or hardworking? Did you really do your best? What did you hold back and why? What did you believe that was untrue? Why did you believe it? What did you really want? Did you have an inflated view of your worth? Were you sincere? Try to see the influence of your past on your present attitude and to recognize when your responses are exaggerated or the result of unrealistic expectations, unresolved feelings, and false hopes. More than what you do, what you own, whom you are with, or what you have accomplished, you are your feelings. While future generations may isolate your legacy from your emotions and evaluate you in terms of the gift you left behind, the way you feel about yourself right now, at this time and in this place, determines the quality of your life. You live in your feelings, and your happiness depends upon whether you like the way you feel or not. If you understand how your feelings work, you understand how your defenses operate, how your personality developed, and what motivates your behavior. Without understanding your feelings, you are a mystery to yourself. Feelings do not just appear out of the blue. They are related to events, thoughts, dreams, and comments. Your feelings are easy to understand once you have some perspective. However, there are few tasks more difficult than trying to understand a powerful emotion when it holds you in its grasp. The intensity of a feeling results not only from the events that caused it, but also from the stored up feelings that were reanimated and triggered loose. That is why strong emotions are so confusing. To begin with, there are two basic feelings, pleasure and pain. The focus here will be concerned with the management of pain. The name given to these feelings depends upon when the feeling occurs. Pain in the future is anxiety. The pain hasn't happened yet. Thus, anxiety is a warning of an injury or a loss that could take place. Then again, it could be avoided, or you could be entirely mistaken and there is no danger. You merely misinterpreted what you perceived, or it reminded you of something frightening, perhaps an old loss you hadn't dealt with. Pain in the present is hurt. Hurt is experienced as sadness and disappointment. Hurt is taking place right now. The evidence for the hurt is obvious, right in front of you. The damage speaks for itself. Hurt is the most real of all feelings, easiest to share with others and for them to comprehend. Pain in the past is anger. Anger is resentment over being hurt. Therefore, anger always requires an explanation which relates it to the hurt that caused it. When anger is not immediately expressed with the hurt that caused it, it is stored in emotional debt. There it is combined with other anger and to some extent made less real. Later, when you express the anger, you have to make a case for the hurt you suffered. Unfortunately, it's then more difficult for others to follow your reasoning, because the longer you keep anger from expression, the more distorted it seems when you finally release it. When anger festers inside, it activates memories of other old hurts and takes on their anger. This is the main reason that anger confuses you. You don't understand the volume, intensity, or the seeming inappropriateness of old anger when it breaks through. When anger is directed inwards, it is called guilt. It takes considerable psychic energy to withhold anger. The defenses that constrain anger are not specific, but general shields that hinder the expression of all feelings, good and bad. This explains why people who repress anger don't seem loving. Your defenses not only direct your anger inwards, but also your attention, and thus preoccupy you. The depletion of psychic energy to withhold anger is called depression. The energy that is required to keep anger from expression is part of your total energy that is available to solve problems, be creative, love, motivate yourself, and live your life. If energy is diverted from your life, the total amount of energy available to you is depressed. The more feelings you hold in, the more depressed you are. Feelings have a definite purpose in the animal kingdom and are related to ensuring survival. While man has the capacity to evaluate a situation and place it in perspective, Creatures with a primitive frontal lobe development have less ability to do so. They must rely on their instincts and immediate reactions to ensure their survival. Those instincts speak first through feelings. Painful feelings in animals are directly translated into a physical response. Feelings serve the same basic purpose in humans as they do in animals. However, in man, they undergo subtle changes, the prejudice of memory and reason. The purpose of anxiety is to warn you of danger and to initiate those physiological responses upon which a successful escape or defense depend. Anxiety increases your heart rate and breathing and causes blood to be shunted to the major extremities. Anxiety supports your survival. To deal with anxiety, ask the following questions. Am I in danger? What loss am I facing? A loss of love, control, or esteem? Why is this risk important to me? What are the chances of this loss actually occurring? What can I do to prevent or to limit this loss? Is the loss real or am I imagining it? When was the last time I felt this way? When was the first time I felt this way? Did what I fear before ever come to happen? Use your fear as a guide to help you understand and prepare for a challenge, not as an excuse for abandoning it. Every important risk involves fear. Don't run from your fear. Don't pretend to be fearless. You just want to recognize danger and learn to adapt to it. Jerry had suffered for years with his wife Nancy's chronic anxiety and was forced to call her 10 times a day to report on his activities. She was afraid Jerry was going to have an affair, the way her father had cheated on her mother. One evening, Jerry was in an accident on the way home and taken to the emergency room where he required a dozen stitches. When he arrived 6 hours late, Nancy greeted him in an angry panic, showering him with a tirade of accusations, totally ignoring his injuries. For the first time in their marriage, Jerry could see the problem clearly. He shouted for Nancy to pay attention, saying it was he who was injured, that reality mattered more than her fears, and that her selfishness made him want to leave her. By confronting Nancy with the worst of her fears and pointing out that she was causing the problem, he shocked her into a new awareness. For the first time, Nancy was forced to reach beyond her fears and take action. To overcome your fear of being afraid, this is what you have to do. Admit and understand your self-doubts. Make a plan. Initiate that plan. Do the very thing you fear. Expect to be afraid as you do it. Do it anyway. Keep going. The purpose of hurt is to limit the extent of the damage done to you. If you didn't have the sensation of pain, you wouldn't know what danger to avoid. You'd be badly scarred and crippled. You learn your life lessons in pain, so experiencing pain is necessary to grow. Feeling your emotional pain initiates the healing process. Pain in the present is as real a feeling as you can get. Expressing pain when it happens is vital to keeping yourself safe and your relationships honest. Saying, "Ouch, that hurts," is the universal sentiment that causes others to hold back. It tells the dentist to ease up, the masseuse to be more gentle, and the ardent lover to change tactics. It lets others know that they have gone too far in hurting your feelings. Telling someone they hurt you puts them on notice and tests their intentions. Knowing that you hurt and why is understanding what is important to you. Pain creates clear limits. It waves a red flag that says, "Go no further." It defines the edge of trespass. The purpose of anger is to reinforce the expression of hurt. Instead of holding in your hurt and allowing yourself to be damaged further, your anger urges you to exclaim, "Ouch, hey, what are you doing? That hurt. Don't do that. Stop that." To make it effective, the expression of hurt always requires revealing the edge of anger. You show a little anger to get others to stop hurting you. If you don't, you're depending on your display of hurt alone to protect you, which may not work. In the animal kingdom, the conversion of hurt into anger is vital for survival, since other animals only hold back when they are opposed. The anger that develops in immediate response to a hurt is the only anger that is completely true. While anger is pain in the past, The longer you wait to express that anger, the less real it becomes. If you wait years to express your anger, it seems ridiculously overblown, and you seem a little crazy to be angry for so long. Old anger often leads you to exaggerate the facts in order to rationalize and justify your staying angry. So in a sense, expressing old anger is telling a lie. This explains why expressing volumes of anger has limited therapeutic benefit. The natural therapeutic process does not move forward when a person lies. This is why people who are always angry can't seem to get better until they release their old hurt and forgive. It is possible to realize a benefit by encouraging a person to let out his old feelings by proxy at a safe target. It's a valid therapeutic technique, but it can get precarious. While ranting at artificial targets can easily produce a display of rageful emotion, doing so can be disorganizing to someone who is fragile and struggling to stay intact. For this reason, so-called anger work, in which people are enthusiastically encouraged to scream, punch pillows, or use styrofoam bats to strike out, can liberate more anger than the person feels comfortable managing, overwhelm his defenses, and precipitate a crisis of lowered self-esteem. Ideally, expressing anger by proxy should employ as the target a tangible present injury that warrants the expression of anger. By encouraging the expression of that reasonable anger, the natural therapeutic process can be initiated, and with it, older feelings can also be resolved. The following illustrates how this is done. When Miriam was widowed after 50 years of marriage, she developed an unrelenting burning sensation in her eyes, but could not cry. In therapy, it became clear that her symptoms reflected her withheld tears of rage. Her husband had always been affectionate and loving, but had never been much of a wage earner. His insurance policy was meager, and his military benefits were used up at the funeral. Miriam found herself resentful over her severe financial restriction. Although it was the truth, encouraging Miriam to express her secret resentment towards her husband for failing to provide was seen as a dangerous tactic. To challenge her affection for him might mobilize more bitterness and run the risk of deepening her depression. So instead, she was encouraged to express her irritation at the VA administration and the Social Security Administration for their delays. The frustration she suffered having to wait for checks was a natural topic of conversation. She was encouraged to complain about the rudeness of government personnel and the unfairness of the system. After a while, she began to feel better, and her depression lifted. Guilt has no purpose. It does nothing to prepare you for danger or help you cope with pain. If anything, guilt makes matters worse by lowering your self-esteem and your sense of deservability. Guilt does not seem to have a positive role in the natural therapeutic process. If anything, guilt is a sign that the natural therapeutic process has gone awry. Conscience is not guilt. Your sense of conscience causes you to feel remorse after you have hurt someone or done something wrong. It is a function of your higher brain, the same part that is responsible for abstract thinking, creativity, and altruism. It allows you to rise above the self. Your conscience acts like a brake on your aggression, bidding you to hold back even before you've hurt others. Your conscience refers you to standards of behavior beyond that of the current swarm of feelings and to overcome the tide of momentary emotions. Conscience allows you to persevere over your selfishness and your conformity to values of the pack. Your higher brain enables you to look beyond yourself and your present situation and put yourself in the position of others and empathize with their pain. While guilt serves no obvious purpose, it remains the most complicated of all feelings. Your imagination can lead you far astray when it comes to feeling guilty. Guilt makes it possible for you to assume responsibility for events over which you have absolutely no influence or control, to feel guilty about them, and by so doing, to punish yourself for years. No matter how good their lives are, guilt-ridden people only seem to hear the negative subtitles their mind provides. What are those subtitles? You're not deserving. You're terrible for even thinking such a thing. See, it's your fault. Now look at what you've done. Your parents were right, you're an idiot. No one in his right mind would want someone like you. You're never going to make it. You never should have done this. You never should have said that. You're a hopeless jinx. It's important to point out that these mental comments are continually being superimposed on your mistakes and failures. While they are usually spoken in your own voice, it is often with the inflection of a parent or some person who did not believe in you. However, just because these thoughts recur doesn't mean you have to pay attention to them. As a matter of fact, most of us brush such comments aside all the time. It's just natural to hear them in your head and shrug them off, a mental whoops. Just because an old condemnation breaks through into your awareness doesn't mean you have to take it seriously. It's just a form of mental background noise, an old forgotten emotional pathway echoing the way you used to feel. So let go of it. The ease with which you can admit that you sometimes doubt yourself and feel this way, the healthier you are. We now approach the onset of depression. Guilt drives you further back into your mind where you pay less attention to the world. The first purpose of this retreat is self-protective, to become a non-combatant and spare other people the danger of your anger, your badness. Unfortunately, when you retreat from the pain of reality, you also pull away from the joys that validate life and make your struggle seem meaningful. As your energy is turned inward, you give up your exercise programs, your hobbies, and your external attachments. Work suffers, productivity drops, and with it self-esteem. Others pull away, the world becomes monochromatic, the intrusive subtitles begin to sound more and more like realities. The following are the subtitles of depression. You're better off dead. You shouldn't have been born. No one likes you. No one cares, ever. The world is against you. You'll never make it. You're a helpless baby. You're trapped and powerless. You're weird. You're not a real man or woman. You've been a fool to believe that you could be happy. At a glance, it becomes clear that these messages are just absurd, almost childish, the kind of statements children taunt each other with when they're angry. They'd be almost comical were it not for the fact that when you're depressed, you lack the energy to put these negative thoughts aside or refute them. You may actually believe them to be true, and tragically, you may even act on them. Depression is a lowered state of energy. Your energy has been diverted to contain your anger. With the limited energy that remains, it is hard to be productive, to do the work that supports your self-esteem, to love yourself or love others. Although depression, like guilt, does not serve a positive function, it is felt in the body. Bodily functions slow down. You become constipated and lose weight. You're unable to sleep. When you do, you have troublesome dreams which escaping anger leaves in its wake. When you're awake, you're troubled by dark thoughts which can become so gruesome that they challenge your belief in your goodness. In this state, you can make a more trenchant and comprehensive case for putting yourself down than anyone else. You've been a party to all your negative behavior and thoughts. At the slightest question of your worth, your mind readily provides the proof that you're bad and deserve to suffer. You betray yourself. Depression is always your doing. Richard was a 70-year-old grandfather who had suffered from episodes of depression following his retirement. He had spent his life working for his family, never doing anything for himself. Although he complained about working so hard, his job was his identity and strength, and when he retired, he felt lost and without purpose. Richard grew up in a poor family and decided when he was just a boy that he would redeem himself by making money. Richard thought he was vindicating himself by overcoming his poverty, but the sad truth was that his parents were not only poor, but emotionally impoverished. His mother and father cited their poverty as the reason they did not give him what he needed, even when his need was just to be held, reassured, or told that he would amount to something. Richard continually struggled to contain his feelings of resentment towards his parents. Although he became a success over the years, he found himself holding back emotionally from his own children and began to wonder if he were no better than his own parents. Since he identified so much with his work, Richard's self-esteem began to slip shortly after his retirement, and he began to obsess about his childhood deprivation. Each time his anger surfaced, he pushed it down again. When his daughter invited him to his grandson's 4th birthday, he agreed to attend, but with great reluctance. When Richard saw his grandson receiving loving attention, he felt a pang of jealousy and felt ashamed for feeling that way. When the blindfolded grandson smashed the piñata and presents showered down all around him, Richard was suddenly struck with a fearful urge to kill his grandson. The idea terrified him. Unsure whether he would act on his feelings, Richard sought to gain safety for his grandson by putting distance between them and retreated. Richard left the party early, deeply troubled. On the turnpike, he found himself behind an older couple driving in a very expensive foreign car. Richard pretended that he was under their benevolent protection, a kind of compensation for not being cared for by his own parents. The fantasy calmed him down. Richard imagined what his life would have been like if this couple had been his parents. Feeling insulated by the good life he envisioned, Richard permitted himself to compare it to the deprivation of his own childhood and examine his parents' withholding without making excuses for them. He could see why he felt so jealous of his grandson and wanted to kill him. It all made sense now. He wasn't evil. He'd just been cheated by ungiving parents. When, after an hour, the older couple exited the turnpike, Richard took the event personally and felt abandoned. A flood of old anger swarmed over him. Struggling to keep his anger in place, he became disoriented, took his foot off the accelerator, and coasted to the side of the road. The state troopers brought him to the hospital. Fortunately, the events of the day had brought the pain of the past to the surface, and for the first time, he was able to discuss his old pain openly, forgive his parents, and resolve his lifelong depression. Letting go and becoming free to live in the present are the work of the mourning process. The mourning process and the natural healing process are essentially the same. The mourning process describes how you grieve a tragic and crushing loss. The losses that initiate it are almost always real and powerful, such as the loss of a loved one. Since the mourning process is usually deep and prolonged, the steps you pass through are distinct and often pronounced. There are 3 general stages of mourning: the injury, coping, and acceptance. Although the 3 basic defenses, denial, blaming or excuses, and pretenses, can be seen throughout the mourning process, one defense usually predominates in each stage. In fact, the stage of mourning is defined by what defense you are struggling to overcome. The stage of injury is dominated by denial. This is the stage of mourning you most dread, the moment of horror when you learn that someone you care about has died or is dying. This moment has the greatest impact of all events. The prospect of such a loss arrests the attention of the entire human race. When life is kind to you, the injury phase of mourning begins before the loss actually takes place, allowing you to anticipate the loss of a loved one and make your peace with him. You may not be able to prevent the loss, but sometimes you can guide the grief into more comfortable circumstances. But giving up denial may take years to complete. Linda and Ben had been each other's constant companions throughout their 30-year marriage and planned to travel when he retired. Shortly before that, Ben, who had emphysema and still smoked, developed difficulty breathing and was hospitalized with pneumonia. Within a few days, his condition suddenly became critical, and without warning, he died. When the doctor told Linda the news, it seemed as if he were talking about someone else. Nothing seemed real. Linda refused to believe what happened. Linda kept the house exactly as she always did. Everything was in its place except for her husband. She lived her whole life as his partner and never saw herself in any other role. She could not get accustomed to her new situation. Each morning she waited at the breakfast table expecting Ben to come downstairs. She even thought she heard him getting dressed in the bedroom. In the afternoon she sat at the window waiting for him to return home. Linda's denial fluctuated. Some days she believed Ben was alive. Some days she doubted it, but she was never really convinced he was gone. As the weeks passed, Linda began to get confused and disoriented. Her emotional ties to her husband were in place, but there was no husband to attach to. Her mind played tricks on her. Once she even thought she saw him in the living room, but when she looked up again, he was gone. Shaken, Linda found herself groping for stability and balance. One day, while cleaning out some shelves, Linda found a carton of cigarettes and the thought crossed her mind, "Why doesn't he stop smoking? It'll kill him." A swell of hurt and anger flushed through her body as she sighed. It did kill him. 6 months after the funeral, Linda finally began to mourn. Her anger at Ben for not taking better care of himself flooded to the surface, and she knew for the first time that Ben would never come home. The coping phase of the mourning process begins as soon as your denial weakens enough to permit you to ask questions about what happened. In a sense, you begin to cope when you first think the loss may be true. The coping phase continues until denial is gone. Coping is facing the unresolved feelings of hurt and anger that continually break through your remaining denial. The practice of wearing black during the first 30 days of mourning alerted others to your vulnerability in this phase of mourning, a time of great emotional instability where a trivial comment can suddenly break through your weakening denial and permit painful feelings to escape. The coping phase is punctuated by many episodes of toxic nostalgia in which the residual unmourned grief is continually being symbolically tapped. During the first phases of coping, when denial begins to retreat, the intellect takes over to form a bypass over the pain. Because you're really starting to hurt, you try to find something to do. During this phase of mourning, it is typical to accuse others for their contributory negligence, while alternately blaming yourself and making excuses for your own shortcomings. This is the time when you direct your self-condemnation outwards. Even if you don't express your accusations, you still secretly blame anyone you can and resent them. The relative who didn't take the person to the doctor, the ambulance driver for making the heart attack worse by driving too fast, the nurse who didn't come promptly. During this stage, it's typical to define an endless list of targets, initiate malpractice suits, seek custody, and challenge wills. Such blaming is a futile and alienating exercise, doing more harm than good. Open antagonism at this time interferes with the mourning process, further injuring everyone involved. Regrets make up one of the critical parts of the coping phase. You regret what you should have done, could have done, would have done, might have done, but didn't do. You regret your inaction, your overreaction, your rashness, and your procrastination, your excesses, and your holding back. Your regrets stay with you for years, returning at anniversaries and birthdays, in settings where you spend time together, favorite haunts, restaurants. Such regrets form the bulk of the toxic nostalgic intrusions that ruin the day. You begin to accept a loss the very first time you set your denial aside. Acceptance accompanies coping and defines a painful and irregular journey. You have good days and bad days. You cannot have a good day when you are full of denial because you're fighting against the truth. However, you can seem to have a good day when you are pretending. In fact, at the beginning of the grieving process, most so-called good days are merely pretense. Acceptance begins when you are able to speak of your loss with a bearable sadness, without having to shut it off because it reminds you of the hurt you still can't face. Even so, some unmourned hurt will always return when you remember, but it no longer causes you to avoid situations which might remind you of the loss. When you are emotionally healed, your recollections will still be able to sadden you, but they will not trigger you into mourning again. When you are in arrears expressing your feelings, you are in emotional debt. If emotional problems were classified the same way as physical illnesses, they would be considered storage diseases. The heart of all emotional problems is that instead of pain being dealt with at the time it happens, its expression is postponed. The emotion is stored rather than expressed or coped with. You ignore anxiety because you're afraid of being afraid. Stored anxiety feeds on itself and expands. You block hurt because you cannot face the injury or its consequences. As a result, hurt converts to anger and anger to guilt. Both of these feelings are stored in emotional debt waiting expression. There are 3 general levels of emotional debt: current, recent, and remote. Current emotional debt describes the unexpressed feelings of the present moment or past few days or weeks. Typically, these unexpressed feelings are the reaction to an event that has just happened or is still evolving. You haven't gotten your bearings yet to be sure of what you're feeling, and so you're waiting to express yourself. Your access to the emotions stored in this current emotional debt corresponds to your mind's scratchpad memory, the place you store your parking space in the public garage. It's momentary storage. When you return to your car, you release the information. It's doubtful that you could remember where you parked just the day before unless something happened to make that event memorable, like being scraped by another car. Thus, to become more permanent, a current memory must either have importance to you or be associated to an emotional impression. Without forgetting, your life would be so full of mental debris that you could not think your way to work and back. Imagine remembering everything you experienced. It may make for an entertaining party game, but it would cripple your ability to function because you'd have too much to sort through. The key is to remember what is important and to let go of what is not. With feelings, it is important to resolve pain as directly as possible so that it does not get blown out of proportion or become stored. Unresolved emotions continually invade this space, compromising the brain's ability to function freely. The following is a typical example of how feelings in current emotional debt are dealt with, as well as the inhibitions that block their expression. Imagine you are at a party at a friend's house who jokingly introduces you to another guest by telling him he'll like you because you never take anything seriously. You have absolutely no idea what your friend meant, but you feel awkward. You begin to doubt yourself and wonder if you heard the comment correctly, or if you took it the wrong way. You sneak a look in a mirror and ask yourself if you appear superficial. You can't figure out what kind of game your friend is playing. You feel a little hurt to be depicted as shallow, but don't know what to do about it. You wonder what the guest thinks. He seems to act a little too lighthearted when he talks to you, and you wonder if he's been prejudiced by the hostess's trifling depiction of you. You find yourself acting a little too serious to correct the impression. During dinner, you start to tell a funny joke, but then realize that sharing it might reinforce your host's comments. You suddenly feel as if you've been put on the spot, a little compromised. You become a bit detached. You decide to talk to your friend after dinner. She begins the conversation by observing, "You seem a little quiet tonight." The comment irritates you, and you decide to postpone your confrontation. As you drive home, you replay the events of the evening. Your hurt has evolved into anger. You question your friend's motivation. You feel you have let yourself down by being silent and cowardly. You revisit other scenes in your life when you also did not speak up. A familiar feeling of defeat and impotence returns. You feel bitter. Suddenly you see flashing lights in your rearview mirror and realize you're doing 60 in a 40-mile zone. You try to talk your way out of the ticket, but it goes badly because the officer thinks you have a bad attitude. A $75 fine. By the time you get home, you feel like exploding. You start to call your friend, but you realize it's too late and you are far too angry, so you decide to go to bed. But you can't fall asleep and you obsess about the situation. You can barely control yourself as you leave a message to meet after work on your friend's answering machine. All day you are preoccupied and make stupid mistakes at work. Deciding to be diplomatic, you go over the remarks you intend to make. But the moment your friend sits down in the coffee shop, you blurt out, "You hurt my feelings last night when you told that guest I was shallow." Not a word about the wonderful dinner or how nice the house looked. Manners have taken a holiday. "I never said such a thing," your friend denies just as quickly, truly hurt by your bluntness and feeling a little ambushed. Actually, she never did say anything like that. She said that you didn't take anything seriously, but for some reason the exact words slip your memory. "I was just telling Elliot what a great sense of humor you used to have," she explains. Her sentiment feels honest, even though your memory of the event differs. Still, you feel frustrated. The point to remember is that it only takes a little unexpressed comes recent emotional debt. Although the transition is imperceptible, the difference is real. Current emotional debt is a fluid state. In a sense, feelings are in the process of passing through you. You expect to release them. Recent emotional debt is a more rigid, closed, and resigned position. You are determined to hold your feelings in place, and the after effects are significant. As your defenses become fortified to contain your hurt and anxiety, distortion begins to work its transformational ways. You become less flexible, more set in your withholding. This defensiveness consumes energy and begins to deplete you. As a result, your spontaneity and freedom are diminished. You're not at your best. The feelings in recent emotional debt make up the bulk of your unfinished business. You are generally conversant with the details of each account in which you are in emotional arrears. Pretty much you know who has hurt you or what has frightened you, and you could recall all the facts if you had to. The feelings stored in recent emotional debt range from coping with a recent death, rejection, or betrayal, to your concern about an ailing parent or a struggling child, your failing business, or your problematic career. Some of these injuries can be as recent as a week ago, or can be troubling you for years. Since hurt rapidly evolves into anger, and anger makes you doubt your worth, unexpressed emotions soon make your original problem seem worse than it was. The injury that was once so clear and simple now seems complicated. You may be wallowing in self-pity, suffering from panic, entertaining dark fantasies of revenge, or be feeling guilty or depressed. Your reasoning is continually being fueled by resentment. You become preoccupied with betrayal, being cheated, used, or treated unfairly. After a while, you get lost in the short-circuited courts of emotional justification and blame, gathering evidence, planning retaliation. Your negative energy is continually leaking, causing you to appear emotionally brittle. As your stored feelings begin to commandeer your mind's storage space, your memory suffers. You are easily distracted, and you find it difficult to concentrate. As this state progresses, your logic becomes the slave of your defenses, circuitous and repetitive. You tend to obsess and keep bumping into the same rigid mental detours. You find yourself at the place you started. Because you've made up your mind, no one wants to argue with you. The following illustrates how an unresolved, overwhelming trauma can be stored in recent emotional debt and take over your life. It is not so much the trauma itself that causes the problem, but the feelings that were suppressed during the trauma and the guilt and suffering that resulted when, out of fear of what those feelings might reveal, they could not be spoken. The Sanchez family lived in a tiny home 50 yards away from a tight turn on a railroad track. Enrique, the father, always had suspicions about the safety of the grade, and every time a train passed, he wondered about it, feeling irritated at the railroad company and the city for tolerating such danger, and secretly feeling ashamed of himself for not being able to afford a better location for his family. One morning after Enrique went to work, his wife and 5 children heard a loud explosion and ran for safety. Mother, who did piecework as a garment worker at home, was with her employer at the time. Mother's immediate concern was to save her means of support, and momentarily forgetting about her children, she escaped with her employer. The 5 children, who were in another room, ran out of the house and climbed into the family van that was parked in the driveway. They closed the van door just as a second explosion engulfed the house and the car in a fireball. The children tried to get out of the van, but the rear doors did not open from the inside, and the handles in the front were too hot to touch. They felt as if they were going to be burned to death and started to panic. Mother, who had reached the other side of the street with her employer, turned around at the sound of the explosion to discover in horror the plight of her children, whom she could see pounding on the van windows. Although burned and in pain, she ran to the van, opened the door, and brought her children to safety. Enrique, who was at work 10 miles away across the city at the time, looked up to see the explosion. As he saw the smoke rise, Enrique thought to himself, "Good, that will teach the damn railroad a lesson." At that moment, a neighbor called, telling him that the very explosion he was mocking involved his home and his family. Not knowing whether his family was safe, Enrique inched home in clotted traffic in a borrowed car, which kept stalling and adding to his frustration. His fears for the worst grew, and by the time he reached his street, his anxiety was unbearable. When he arrived at the house, the fire department was just putting out the fire, and his family had all been taken to the hospital. It was hours before he found out they had survived. Miraculously, although the mother had bad burns on her arms, none of the children were hurt. The emotional damage to the family, however, was considerable, and their stresses continued to mount. They tried to be glad they survived, but survival was difficult. The Sanchez home was unlivable, and disaster funding was unavailable. Not knowing where to turn, the family became homeless. Broken in pride and shattered by the vulnerability he felt, Enrique could not shake off the guilt he felt on commenting the way he had about the explosion before he found it involved his family. In the best of times, Enrique was closed, stoic, and superstitious. Now, to be asked to respond to his family's turmoil made him uncomfortable, and having to give up his job to take care of his wife made him feel powerless. Mother was unable to work because of her burns. Even though her reaction was understandable, she felt guilty about running out of the house with her employer and momentarily forgetting about her children. She continually relived the explosion, seeing her children trapped in the van. This preoccupation made her feel so unworthy she found it difficult to assume her mothering role. The children, in fact, felt abandoned when their mother left with her employer, but they would never dream of saying anything and suppressed their resentment. The oldest daughters, who badly needed their parents' support, now adapted by taking on mother's duties as they tried to conceal their lingering terror and resentment. Because they were now homeless, children were unable to attend their usual school and to leave their friends. They were displaced in every sense of the word. After the accident, the Sanchez family was uprooted. Everything changed. They lived in a continual state of fear and uncertainty. All they had was each other, but since they'd all been damaged, when one sympathized with the other, his own pain burst forward and reinforced the pain of the person he was consoling. Instead of helping, family members aggravated each other and struggled to hold their feelings back, which only made matters worse. For months, the family wandered homeless in this pathetic state until their house was finally repaired. However, the family that returned home was not the family that used to live there. The oldest daughter was now taking care of the baby. The second oldest daughter was taking care of mother. Father was unable to return to work because of his stress. He'd become overprotective and rigid as well, a compensation for his guilt and feelings of weakness. In the Sanchez family situation, there was no opportunity for stored anxiety to be relieved. No one could get their bearings long enough to be sure of anything. They wallowed in this state of paralyzing anxiety for almost 2 years before they sought help from a team of professionals. The family had become prisoners of their stored anxiety and began to project their concerns onto the world. Enrique became fearful of men's sexual advances towards his daughters, an overprotective compensation for his guilt over his belief that he failed to protect his family adequately. 2 of the girls developed school phobia. Mother lost confidence in her ability to sew. The family looked for signs of impending disaster everywhere. They expected the worst when a family member was just late for dinner. They instructed the children to call home many times a day. When stored anxiety builds, and a person does not have his usual reference points to guide his assessment of reality, it is easy to become spooked, to panic, to expect the worst, and to imagine that the worst is happening. In the case of the Sanchez family, this process was made worse by the fact that each member of the family reinforced each other's worst expectations. A key therapeutic move with the Sanchez family was to have each daughter tell mother how she was hurt when mother left her in the van and then forgive mother. It was extremely difficult to get the children to do this. During the meeting, they all wept both for each other and for mother, whom they were trying to protect from their anger. However, once mother got past her guilt for abandoning the children, and the children got over their resentment for being abandoned, the anxiety in the family diminished. The anxiety the children felt over being angry at their mother was for them the worst part of the ordeal, especially since it was culturally forbidden to speak to those feelings. The most difficult person to help was Enrique, who refused to admit his fears and guilt until everyone else seemed better. In other words, Enrique could only admit he was afraid when there was no longer anything at all to be afraid of. Remote emotional debt involves glimpses of old feelings. The older your feelings, the more mysterious they seem. Sometimes a shadowy remnant of a distant memory drifts into your awareness. A present event evokes something vaguely familiar, but you cannot make out its reflection in time's cloudy mirror. The trails of the memory fade, and you're left trying to place the intrusive disquiet. It is likely that many of the experiences commonly referred to as déjà vu are merely incomplete recollections of feeling fragments from the storehouse of remote emotional debt. When you have a large backlog of remote emotional debt, you are likely to be visited by vague feelings that you cannot readily identify, some pleasant, some not. The awareness of these feelings usually occurs by unexpected triggering rather than intentional recall. When you do recall these feelings, you cannot be sure of the accuracy of the recollection or if it is a single or combined memory. It is fair to say that you experience remote emotional debt almost exclusively as toxic nostalgia. The feelings in remote emotional debt often manifest in dreams as persistent and ambiguous moods. They are the building blocks of the recurrent dream. Charles experienced such a reaction at his high school reunion banquet. After returning to his seat, which had been marked with his name tag, he found that someone had taken his seat and the people around the table had closed ranks, essentially eliminating his place. It was unintentional, of course, but he found himself becoming deeply hurt and then accusatory, offending his old classmates. His out-of-control behavior made Charles flush with petulance and reduced him to tears, causing him great embarrassment. Charles had a manipulative father who thought he was a crybaby, and from as early as he could remember, father set his two older brothers against him to toughen him up. Charles always got the worst of these conflicts and grew up feeling both defeated and unfairly treated. Charles could only express his hurt at the risk of being belittled by his brothers. He grew up at a little distance from others, a kind of emotional fugitive, always looking out for the next possible injustice. In revisiting his high school, Charles' old memories of childhood and feeling cheated began to resurface. These feelings merged with the oversight at the table and led him to overreact and create the unpleasant scene. This quality of vague familiarity characterizes all feelings in remote emotional debt. Generally, as in Charles' case, that old feeling is not recognized as itself when it appears. Instead, you focus on the present situation on which it is superimposed. The situation may feel familiar enough to make you acknowledge, see, it's happening again, without even being aware of the specific context of the older feeling. This is a good example of an emotional blind spot. The following guide will help you express feelings in current, recent, and remote emotional debt. The next time you feel overwhelmed by an event which seems to release a greater emotional response than you expected, try to get a little distance. Don't permit yourself to get lost in a rage or tears, exasperation, or fear. Instead, pay close attention to the unexplainable part of your response. Accept that your old feelings have just been activated. See this intrusion as a privilege and be grateful for the opportunity to heal that this provides. Consider what just happened and how you reacted. Setting your self-justification aside, ask yourself, is there any excessive volume in the feelings I'm expressing? This is a very difficult thing to admit, since like everyone else, you want to think of yourself as well-balanced and appropriate. Remember, this is an exercise in deciphering the forces that lead you to distort. So be patient and open to the possibility that you are not perfect. This may help you discover a new strength. Ask yourself, are my feelings at all inappropriate, childish, prefabricated, or familiar? Now try to define how. Focus again on the present event that triggered your excessive response and ask yourself, what older feeling gave this trigger its power to disturb me so? Give yourself time to hear the answer. If the feeling is vaguely familiar, ask what it reminds you of. If this feeling brings another situation to mind, consider that other situation, but don't relive it. Just observe yourself in the previous situation if you can. Your goal is to understand what happened, not allow yourself to get lost in the old feeling. Don't put the feeling aside because it is uncomfortable. Just acknowledge how powerful the emotion feels. Now, still holding this older feeling at a little distance, realize that it has been triggered into awareness because it wants to be expressed. Try to place its source as exactly as you can. Now just feel the feeling again. Give the feeling a name. If it is guilt or anger, seek to identify the hurt you suffered. If it is sadness or disappointment, describe the loss you suffered. If it is anxiety, try to define what you thought might happen to you. Now let yourself feel the feeling again. This time, define the details of the situation. What happened? How old were you? Who else was involved? What did they do or say? How did you react? How did you want to react? Why couldn't you do what you wanted? Is that really the truth? Now, ask yourself, how did you contribute to this situation? Were similar old feelings intruding then? What were they and where did they come from? Now, apply these same questions to that even older situation. Correct your responses so they are as truthful as possible. Remember, your truthful acceptance of all you feel activates the natural therapeutic process to resolve it. If you are successful in this exercise, you will create a brief moment of mourning in which you will grieve the past anew. Your defenses are the single most defining part of your character. They shape the way you react to the positive as well as the negative parts of your life. Your defenses determine how honest, open, loving, trusting, giving, expressive, responsive, caring, compassionate, sharing, accepting, patient, and forgiving you are. They also define your capacity for deceit, suspicion, resentment, dishonesty, isolation, withholding, indifference, restlessness, irritability, and cowardice. The purpose of your defenses is to cushion you from the full impact of a fear or hurt so you can function. Your defenses are designed to provide a temporary adaptation to danger or loss. When their usage becomes more firmly established, they predispose you to create emotional debt. The way your defenses screen your pain defines your style of coping. You tend to admit the friendly feelings and exclude those that hurt. Your defenses skew your view of the world. As they become more established, your defensive pattern becomes your reality. When your defenses are rigid, they lower your self-esteem and lead you to be self-destructive. They diminish your ability to see and hear clearly. They undermine your ability to act spontaneously in the moment, and they lead you to procrastinate. They make you fearful, mistrustful, and protective. They limit your ability to grow. When your defenses are lowered and you are willing to be vulnerable, you learn easily from your experiences. You feel optimistic in spite of heavy odds against you because, aware of your limitations and failures, you still believe in yourself. Your defensive pattern also determines how others react to you. People tend to be more open with open people and closed with people who are guarded. Defensive people are difficult to be around, harder to talk to, less rewarding to share with. Your particular defensive shield formed as you grew. The periods in which each of the three defenses developed correspond to the three phases of childhood development: the dependent, the controlling, and the competitive periods. You retain some defensive legacy from each of these three periods. However, your particular pattern of defenses is a unique mixture of all three and reflects your childhood experience, especially how easy it was to be open and express your feelings in your home, how safe you felt doing so, and the support and encouragement you got to be honest. Denial is the predominant defense of the dependent period. In a sense, every child is born with a powerful capacity to deny. The child is utterly helpless and has nothing but denial to protect him. He can only shut out the pain he cannot deal with. A child is totally dependent on his parents for his survival. However, emotional survival is not merely making it into adulthood, but how that task is accomplished. Exposed to too much pain, some children are unable to protect themselves adequately from the onslaught of injuries that befall them, and therefore become trapped in a rigid defensive position, the emotional scar that persists throughout life. The characteristic stamp of a childhood injury and its significance is determined more by when the injury takes place than by what actually happens to the child. Thus, a child who is severely hurt in the dependent period is likely to be impaired in his capacity to form loving and trusting relationships in later years. Some children suffer severe losses in their first year, such as separations, the death of a parent, or a severe illness. Although they may be cared for by a loving relative who replaces what has been taken away and seem to make excellent recoveries, These children become especially sensitive to dependent issues. It is understandable. Other people held the key to their fate. Their focus was on their pain and their need to be rescued. In spite of how well adjusted they may become later on, they are especially sensitive to abandonment and rejection. People forever. At one extreme, they can be needy, empathetic to the point of invasiveness, have trouble defining boundaries with others, and have an unrelenting need for another person to make them complete. At the other extreme, especially when they were cherished and well cared for, they're likely to become warm, sensitive to the feelings of others, compassionate, instinctive, giving, supportive, sensitive of others' pain, patient, and willing to draw others out. The healthy dependent person, someone who has had a strong sense of being loved, also develops a sensitivity to people without being rigidly trapped in a needy dependent style. Instead, he strives to be independent, mindful of his dependent needs. He still enjoys being cared for and given to, but without unrealistic expectations that the world owes him anything. Unlike the person who was damaged in the dependent period, he doesn't see being by himself as a punishment. Healthy, dependent people are wonderful companions, the best friends, the most loyal workers, the best parents and teachers. The controlling period contains the origins of blaming and excuses. These defenses evolve at the same time the child develops language skills and body control. The first communication skills are often physical gestures used to express displeasure, such as shaking the head no or pointing a finger at an object the child wishes to have retrieved. In a way, these negative body expressions are a more active representation of feelings that the child had been forced to repress when he did not have such expressive skills. The young child may have turned away, but only as an act of avoidance, a retreat. The older child turns away with an air of defiance and intention. This negative body language is greeted by the parent with a mixture of amusement and annoyance, depending on the parent's state of mind. A happy, well-adjusted parent will take the expression of negativity in stride and attribute it to the child becoming a person. On the other hand, an insecure parent will try to control the child's expression of negativity, taking it as a nursery rebellion, and may overreact and become punitive. This teaches the child that expressing himself risks losing his parent's love. When a young child is intimidated by fear at this stage, it contributes to the establishment of rigid controlling defenses and subsequent remote emotional debt. The child also initiates powerful, positive nonverbal communications at this time, such as smiling, laughing, cooing, making eye contact, hugging, stroking, and kissing. Generally, these positive communications meet with great enthusiasm and encouragement. They are, after all, the joy and reward of parenthood. The miracle happens towards the end of the first year. The child speaks. After mama and dada, the child's first word is likely to be no. It is a powerful word. In fact, the most powerful word the child learns for many years. Saying no from a position of weakness and helplessness elevates the child to the level of an obstacle others must contend with. He is unwilling. He is not pleased. He does not want to eat. He does not want to do potty. He does not want to go to bed. And he says so. No. Just like that, he makes his will known. The impact of saying no or acting it out physically is not lost on the child. In a world of adults, he is suddenly made an equal. All of a sudden, he is picked up and transported against his will to a crib and imprisoned. There is no court of appeal. No doesn't work. It has failed him. He needs other words. In time, he picks up a larger vocabulary and begins to deal with the pain of misbehaving with other phrases. I'm sorry. I'll be good. I didn't do it. Not fair. His language, like Shakespeare's whore unpacking her heart with words, is an attempt to absolve himself and blame others. His motivation is clear. He wants to be lovable and loved. He wants to explain away his badness and divorce himself from it. It is someone else's fault. Remember, he is struggling with a burgeoning emotional debt as his hurts frequently become transformed into angry outbursts which cause him to be punished. This leads to more anger, and so he feels he is bad a lot of the time. The debate between am I good and am I bad is ongoing and causes him much pain. He wants so much to be good, but his anger makes him doubt himself. Blaming is an obvious solution. A child learns to blame by being criticized. Even if the scolding is justified, it makes him feel bad. He is told he is responsible for doing something bad. He wants to shift the blame onto something else. The stool was slippery. The paper was already wet. The dish was too heavy to hold. It was his sister's fault. As the child develops the intellectual defenses that allow him to excuse his behavior or blame it on external circumstances, he is in a real sense learning to use logic to divert the pain of responsibility, the pain of being bad. He is establishing mental detours that shunt his pain outwards rather than allowing it to be felt. The hurt of being bad or wrong is immediately converted into angrily blaming others or external circumstances. The child exercises this diversion as long as it makes him feel better. Like the start of the controlling period, the competitive period begins gradually. The earliest elements of the controlling period appear as soon as the child develops motor control. The competitive period begins when the child starts to use his imagination and pretends in order to make his losses seem less severe. As the child in the controlling period grows, his intellectual defenses of blaming and excusing begin to incorporate pretense as he exaggerates his alibis, pretending that they are true. He may act deeply injured, trying to prove his case against a mean-spirited sibling whom he claimed punched him. His performance is designed to evoke sympathy, substantiate his accusations, and justify his retaliation. He may act out so convincingly that he comes to believe his own story. Where the controlling child yearns to be in charge, writing the rules and enforcing them, the competitive child dreams of winning and basking in the adulation of admirers as he effortlessly trounces his opponents, seeming not to have a care in the world. The child in the competitive period uses pretense to escape from pain. While he is being beaten up, he imagines his revenge and plots his enemy's downfall. He is continually scripting his future success and triumph, imagining himself stronger, more powerful. Someday I'll show them, his fantasies typically begin. He takes courage from these fantasies. They compensate him for his disappointments. This wishful thinking can lead to unrealistic expectations of others and additional hurt when he is let down. A child can also be seduced by his fantasies and seek to live in a world of pretense where, in spite of a recent failure, he imagines himself important, still loved by everyone, still the best. By providing fantastic solutions to his problems, wishful thinking can deprive the competitive child of his will. However, some pretense is necessary to protect and develop self-esteem. It would be damaging if, after failing, the child immediately concluded that he was a loser. It is important to pretend that you can still do it when you fail. Your belief in yourself is, after all, the most important ingredient of success. It gives you the courage to face your weaknesses and correct them, to work hard and do your best. Wishful thinking alone will not bring success. The competitive child is trying to find the balance between wishing for success and working for it. Understanding how your family shaped your defensive style helps you grasp your capacity for distortion. Consider the following family inventory. What behavior was considered inappropriate in your family? What did you risk for being honest? How easy was it for you to say what you felt? How were your feelings accepted when you did express them? Were you taken seriously or were you ridiculed? Did others argue with you? What blind allegiance was rewarded? What individuality was punished? What hypocrisy were you silently forced to endure? Your defensive system is shaped by the way you experience and meet the challenges of the three major developmental periods. It is possible to have dependent, controlling, and competitive children in the very same family. However, the hurts you defend against are determined by your particular family's needs and fears. Your defensive style is your own adaptation, but the issues against which you defend mirror your family's special problems. Your personality type reflects the way you deal with the natural therapeutic process. When you are open, you heal quickly. When you are closed, you suffer. Each personality type protects itself in its own way for its own reasons. Your personality represents your defensive style, reflecting both your honesty and the way you avoid pain. The following descriptions of the character types will allow you to recognize both their inherent weaknesses and potential for good. You need to understand that even if the description of one distinct personality type fits you perfectly, you are nevertheless still a composite of all three types, and you incorporated elements from all three stages of development to form your unique personality. The dependent character is often a woman. Women are trained to be nurturers, and this role is supported by society and family expectations. The concern with love, caring, nurturing, support, constancy is more typical of a woman's expected characterological ideal than society's view of a man. Indeed, women are expected to sacrifice their lives while they have children and to make the home to care for their family. These considerations place women around the hearth more than men. Without debating on the politics of sexuality, it is the current status of women to be more dependent than men. While exceptions to this are everywhere to be found, they do not refute this assumption. In this discussion, the dependent person is therefore designated she. However, what follows is to be attributed to the dependent person, not to women in general. The dependent person is concerned with being lovable. Everything she is and wants stems from this. If others love her, they will protect her and provide for her needs. If she grew up in an unloving household, she will choose someone as a mate who is also unloving, as if she is hoping to win him over and resolve her old needs by proxy. This usually fails. The dependent person tends to suffer from guilt because she needs so much to be loved that she can't risk expressing her hurt in a timely fashion. So, after a while, she builds up such resentment and emotional debt that she begins to doubt her own lovability. Her anger chafes her self-esteem, making her clingy. She continually asks others for reassurance that they still love her. When her demands press others to their limits and they push her away, this only confirms the dependent person's fear that she is not lovable. This causes a tearful cycle of pouting, testing, and more clinging. The dependent person is so blinded by her need for love that she tends to drown in her feelings. She can become so lost in her yearning that she is unable to sort out her old from her new hurts. She lives in a sea of dependency, like a child wanting to make contact, but feeling undeserving or too naughty to reach out to others. She will wait endlessly for others to reach out to her, to apologize and make it better. Often no one comes, and she feels unnecessarily rejected. The dependent person uses denial almost as a reflexive barrier to ward off pain. For this reason, more than any other character type, when the dependent person is hurt, she often does not recognize or express it, leading her to have a built-in delay in her emotional reaction time. This causes her not only to lose touch with the events that hurt her, but to become accustomed to withhold rather than be spontaneous in expressing feelings. Because people do not usually hurt others intentionally, many misunderstandings that could easily be cleared up were she more direct linger instead to torment her. As she waits to express herself, her hurt builds out of proportion, while the other person forgets entirely about the hurtful incident, if he were ever aware of it in the first place. This makes reconciliation difficult. The delay also leads her to wallow in her exaggerated feelings, to doubt their validity, and to conclude that it isn't worth expressing herself to run the risk of being rebuffed. Internalizing her pain, she overstates her case to herself, saying, "After all I've done to be treated like this." Even though she keeps most of her resentment to herself, her anger is palpable and distances her from those she loves. This pattern causes more emotional debt and leads her to suffer. It saps her strength and makes her increasingly sensitive to injury. The denial she uses to conceal her anger slows down her emotional reaction time even more, making withholding more likely, and thus aggravates the cycle of resentment. The controlling character became the way he is in order to have the power to protect himself from abandonment and so avoid feeling vulnerable. He is also concerned with being smart, right, and strong, and acquired his defense mechanisms of blaming and excuses to make up for the times he is not. He uses his power to dispel feelings of helplessness and to keep others from rejecting him. Although many women can be equally controlling, the controlling person is usually a man. Just as from early childhood a girl is told that her role will be a nurturing one, a boy is more likely to have been told he'll be a provider, protector of his family, and therefore should aspire to be a person of substance, power, or influence. These expectations intimidate him, but he's encouraged not to show it. History is replete with the bloody adventures of aging, controlling men compensating for their waning powers by trying to extend their sphere of influence. In their insistence that they are right, they punish enemies, quash dissent, or impose on others their religion or political doctrine as the only true one. Most wars have been fought over controlling issues such as territorial claims, rights of way, and access to markets. History's record of injustice and bigotry reflects the story of men trying to assert power over others to maintain their privileged status. Of course, there have been women involved in such controlling endeavors, but mostly they participated as support to their men where they were equally as vicious or unfeeling. However, today, when women get in positions of control, they are no different from controlling men, except for the fact that their struggle to overcome sexist prejudice may have made them even tougher. Establishing and maintaining boundaries is in a sense the controlling person's business. He draws boundaries around himself and around his feelings, seeking to isolate himself from any feeling that might reveal him to be weak. He separates himself from failures by drawing the line of responsibility to exclude himself from fault. He uses his capacity to blame others as the major force to establish these boundaries and also as the rationale for keeping them in place. He reasons, since others are to blame for his problems, he must control them. His boundaries tend to become too rigid and eventually isolate him from others and himself. This leads the controlling person to suffer from intense loneliness. His activities become increasingly solitary enterprises. The controlling person makes elaborate excuses for his losses, explaining why his injury was caused by something other than his weakness and by someone other than himself. This defensive stance isolates the controlling person from his real feeling. Instead of mourning, he feels self-righteously resentful, and there he is put. The natural therapeutic process is stopped dead in its tracks. Healing is limited by his inability to be vulnerable. The only feeling he feels comfortable expressing is anger. When he is hurt, he tends to become abusive and damage the person he loves most. When he becomes fixed in his self-justification, the other person stops trusting him and removes her love. This throws him into a self-righteous denunciation, even more abusive. Because he has rationalized his actions as being justified, his memory is poor for the injuries he has inflicted. He makes promises, but he is unrepentant. All of his best thinking and rationalizing get him into more difficulty. His need to be right subverts healing. His need to be strong blocks feeling. The competitive person is just as likely to be a man as a woman and defines himself by his actions. In a sense, he is always proving something. This is what he is trying to prove. That he is first, the best, and that he's got whatever it takes to win. He loves adulation, admiration, fame, attention, being noticed, being asked for autographs, being pointed out in whispers as the one to watch. He likes being the fair-haired boy on the way to the top. He likes the promise of being a future winner as much as actually winning. He thrives on the hype. He plays to win even if it's at a casual sport. He loves to beat his best time and best score. The underlying reason is surprising. If he can see himself as still getting better, or at least staying on top, he doesn't have to worry about his decline, his loss of strength or attractiveness. He doesn't have to concern himself with growing old and dying. The competitive person often seems to lose confidence at the very last minute. Instead of giving the extra effort and doing his best, the prospect of discovering his true worth turns him into a coward. He quits the race, pretending that he could have won, insisting that he really didn't try. Where before he seemed so committed to win at all costs, he suddenly reveals an endless supply of reasons that excuse him from failure. His efforts cannot be used to measure his worth because he just wasn't giving his best. He may claim that the goal he is seeking is really not worthy of him, that he was on a fool's errand all this time, and the prize he sought never really mattered to him. By pretending not to care when he suffers a loss, the competitive person thwarts the mourning process. You cannot successfully mourn something that does not matter to you, for the mourning process is then a thing for show, to win sympathy, not earn relief. All of the competitive person's emotional difficulties stem from this weakness. When he pretends that a loss doesn't matter, he becomes a mystery to others who see his cool reaction to tragedy as heartless. Instead of supporting him in his grief, others tend to pull away just when he needs them the most. Should he act out his loss by becoming self-destructive, his self-defeating attitude will seem unfathomable or self-indulgent, causing others to ridicule him and withdraw. His tendency to seek a replacement for what he has lost, rather than mourn it, also defeats the natural mourning process. It places too great a burden on the replacement he has created. The second wife, married just 4 months after the first is buried, must not only make him happy, but also make him forget. This pressure is too much and can sabotage a new relationship and create another loss. In this way, he can become involved in a sequence of symbolic losses stemming from an original hurt that he pretended not to care about. The so-called repetition compulsion is really nothing more than a manifestation of replacing rather than mourning. Toxic nostalgia defines how, in spite of your best efforts and resolutions, you manage to defeat yourself. It would not be possible to talk in depth about the mechanism of toxic nostalgia without first understanding the natural therapeutic process, mourning, the feeling cycle, emotional debt, defenses, and character type. While the following examples seem like portraits of ordinary people in trouble, each represents a person with unresolved feelings that are trying to work themselves out via the mechanism of toxic nostalgia. There is a complicated interplay of emotional debt, character weakness, and defensive style continually operating in these cases. Even the simplest forms of toxic nostalgia reveal a subtle blend of needs, attitudes, and defenses that keep pain from resolution. Underlying all this is the natural therapeutic process, the dynamic motor driving all that is hidden towards disclosure, pressing for the truth to be known. Peter wanted to ask for a raise, but in spite of the fact that he had worked hard, made contributions to the company which resulted in significant sales, and got excellent work reviews, he got a tight feeling in his stomach and broke into a sweat every time he decided to petition his boss. Peter would spend hours dredging up all the mistakes he'd made over the years, almost as if to dissuade himself. He would make the boss's argument to himself that cash was tight and that growth hadn't been what was expected. Finally, acting out of weakness disguised as prudence, he would cancel the appointment, feeling both resentful and weak. Peter's childhood fear of not being good enough had become a generalized belief that he wasn't deserving. This intimidated him in spite of his excellent work record. Also, his need to be perfect, which was his compensation for feeling flawed, made him shy away from anyone, especially a figure in authority, who just might tell him why he didn't deserve a raise and thus prove that his worst fears were true. Also, Peter had long felt taken for granted by his spouse. He held in his resentment of her, only to express himself explosively when he was drinking. These outbursts led him to question his goodness, diminishing his sense of deservability and bleeding his courage when he needed it most. Peter usually told his wife that the time wasn't right to ask for a raise. She would give him a look tinged with disdain. She saw through his insecurity and knew he was making excuses. Peter's passive, self-destructive failure would also serve to punish her and allow him to get even with her for not being more appreciative. Toxic nostalgic manifestations that intrude in this example: Peter's lack of deservability, Peter's anxiety in the face of authority, Peter's identification with the forces against him rather than focusing on his own case, his pretense of prudence to cover cowardice, his pretending to be perfect when feeling self-doubt, his alcohol dependency, his explosive behavior, his passive expression of hurt. Julia found herself in an abusive relationship with a man whom she once pretended was everything she dreamed of. Over time, their life together became increasingly difficult. Julia learned to manage him by being compliant and to give in to him sexually on demand and never to speak when she was hurt. When they were together, there were long, uncomfortable silences. When her son was born, she spoiled him and became overprotective. Her husband felt that she preferred the son over him and was jealous. Julia's friends repeatedly told her she was foolish to remain in such a loveless marriage. Although she recognized the truth in this advice, she felt powerless to act. She often dreamed of being alone, but it frightened her, especially the belief that she would be a bad person if she abandoned her husband. She just couldn't hurt her child by breaking up the family. So she remained and suffered without trying to make it better. Julia had left home to marry when she was 18 because she couldn't stand living with her abusive parents. Without resolving her anger towards them, she sought safety in the arms of the first man who'd asked her to marry. She didn't grow, she didn't finish her education, she knew she had let herself down and had used her husband to escape and felt guilty for doing so. Here are the toxic nostalgic intrusions in this example. Julia's belief she would be bad for saving herself, her fear of being alone, her readiness to conceal her feelings, her tendency to seek safety at all costs, her pervasive self-doubt, her passive self-destructiveness, her resentment of herself for being weak, overprotecting her son, her willingness to accept the unacceptable, and her guilty sufferer. At 16, Steve had already developed a reputation as a liar. He was continually getting into trouble by being disruptive at school. Although no one could prove it, he was suspected of several episodes of petty theft. He was mediocre academically because he never studied hard enough to fulfill his potential. His parents fretted about his lack of drive and complained about his obsession with Mitzi, his girlfriend, who had a powerful grip on him. Steve claimed he would do anything for Mitzi. Mother worried continuously about his late hours and his safety, but secretly she was jealous of Mitzi. Steve was well aware that his fulsome displays of affection towards Mitzi hurt his mother. Mother was suspicious that Steve was on drugs. Feeling powerless, Mother appealed to Mitzi to help manage him. Steve openly resented Mother for meddling. Fearing rejection, Mother became even more indulgent and tried to bribe Steve. In fact, Steve was not on drugs, but Mitzi was, and the reason Steve stole was to pay for her habit. When Steve was arrested breaking open a parking meter, Steve's father took notice for the first time, blaming the mother for being too soft. The family became like a battleground. Toxic nostalgia in Steve's example is largely acted out rather than a set of attitudes or false beliefs, and includes Steve's lying and stealing, his dependency on his girlfriend, sacrificing himself for her love, his self-destructive behavior in school, making his mother jealous and anxious to punish her, taking unreasonable risks to hurt father. When you realize that Peter was married to Julia and Steve was their son, the manifestation of these toxic nostalgic symptoms takes on a different perspective. These three people are continually expressing feelings in symbolic ways, which, if you view them in terms of the present, make only limited sense. Steve resents being coddled and yet has a powerful need to be taken care of. He bribes Mitzi to love him just as his mother indulges him. Julia's smothering overprotectiveness is a remnant of her own unfulfilled childhood needs. Steve wants to reject Mother but feels too guilty. Instead, he seeks a destructive relationship with Mitzi where, by providing for her needs, he can pretend that he is an adult and in control. Steve is also angry at his inadequate father for his self-involvement and perfectionist standards. Steve holds his feelings in just as Mother does. He expresses his resentment at father passively by hurting himself and embarrassing him. He fears father's criticism as much as father feels afraid of being criticized. Julia is still angry at her parents. She is also angry at herself for not being stronger and at Peter, whose abusiveness she provokes by passively undermining his self-esteem. She creates the same environment she escaped from as an adolescent, but this time blames Peter for it. Peter still resents being undermined by his father, is committed to trying to keep up appearances and to appear like a man in control of his life, acting confident and worthy of others' admiration. But Julia will not let him carry off this facade and subtly reminds him that he is flawed. He takes his anger out on her when he is drinking and resents his son in general for ruining his marriage and parading the family's dirty linen in public. If, instead of acting out his feelings, Steve could tell his mother that she was insincere in her giving, he'd feel relieved instead of guilty over his bad behavior. If he could tell his father that he seemed more interested in appearances than in his son and got him to pay attention to him, he'd feel less destructive. Then he would be less needy and feel more deserving and more likely to let go of Mitzi. If Julia could forgive her parents, she'd be able to appreciate what Peter had done for her instead of taking out her old anger on him. This would lower her guilt, so if she found she did not love Peter, she would be better able to save herself. She would also have less need to be overprotective of Steve to compensate for what she hadn't received when she was a kid. If Peter could forgive his father, he'd be able to release the store of anger that had lowered his self-esteem. Then he would be able to be more successful and less envious of his son. His anxiety over his worth would diminish, and he'd be able to decrease his dependency on alcohol to manage it. More confident, he'd be able to deal with Julia without punishing her for not being supportive of his failures. There are 5 components of toxic nostalgia: the unmourned feeling, defensiveness, regressing to the way you were when you were hurt, guilt, and the recollection of healing. When an old feeling is symbolically triggered, it does not return as a perfect replay of the original event, but as a mixture of feelings and attitudes, reflecting several stages in the mourning process. Because there are so many parts to these episodes, they can be confusing and difficult to understand. They can also be disquieting because you probably had hoped that these feelings had been settled long ago. The unmourned feeling signals the pain that still needs to heal. When you are in the throes of acute mourning, there are moments when your denial seems to have blocked the full impact of your loss, giving you the illusion of peace. It is an uneasy arrangement. You know you're just catching your breath. After a while, your pain breaks through again, flailing your spirit with renewed strength. Even so, that returning hurt is only part of the larger loss, the part you are ready to face. There is more behind that to be felt before your pain is completely resolved. You feel a loss bit by bit, depending on how much you can tolerate, how open you are, and how much the loss meant to you. In the mourning process, your suffering is eroded gradually by the waves of truth. Denial holds back the pain, lets you regroup, and then exposes you to it again till it is gone. Mourning is a struggle between the forces of truth and the defenses shielding you from it until, after a while, relief begins to dominate. Therefore, each toxic nostalgic event is just another in a series of exposures to resolving pain. However, when the acute mourning period has passed and the pain has aged, it may be combined with other unresolved pain and mourned together. This makes the later appearance of several old feelings seem illogical and confused. It makes perfect sense that the part of the old feeling that intrudes is the unresolved grief you must still attend to. This is why it feels so painful. The return of unmourned pain is a powerful part of the toxic nostalgia experience. It always catches you by surprise. Your belief in your invincibility is challenged, and you are stunned with a renewed sense of loss and sometimes hopelessness. Defensiveness, the way you protect yourself. When unresolved old pain breaks through, it has just defeated the defenses that have long held it in place. For that reason, not only is the pain visible, but so are the defenses that have contained it. Because there is considerable effort to contain the pain, the defenses are likely to assert themselves with renewed vigor, a logical reaction to having just been overwhelmed. If you can get some distance at this moment, you can gain great insight into your avoidance patterns. Roland was a psychiatrist who was having a great deal of difficulty in his own psychotherapy, trying to come to terms with his personality flaws. Although he portrayed himself as open and honest, when it came to discussing his own feelings, he was secretive and elusive, a trait he refused to admit. When he was threatened, Roland would act superior and self-righteous and find ways to put down his adversaries. He would usually do this with a laugh that had a peculiar, annoying edge to it. Roland refused to accept his psychiatrist's suggestion that they discuss his character traits, and insisted instead on talking about his troubled childhood. When the psychiatrist refused to listen to his endless blaming and told Roland that the next session they would discuss his personality quirks and his avoidance, Roland laughed in the psychiatrist's face, accepting the challenge, ready to prove he was perfection itself. When Roland knew he was going to discuss a touchy subject, he sometimes would be late to his therapy session, and always had an excuse that would reveal how important he was to his patients. His therapist once commented on this as a form of avoidance. So, on the day of the important appointment, Roland left a half hour early to be sure he wouldn't be late. On the way to the session, Roland reviewed his situation and thought of his psychiatrist's allegations. How mistaken he is, Roland thought. How perfectly silly. Roland's concerns began to lift as he pictured himself in his mind's eye defeating the therapist, proving he was open and brave. As he traveled along the highway, he became more and more convinced he was right. He felt stronger with each mile and used that as proof to reassure himself that he was not afraid to confront the truth about himself. In a moment of absolute giddiness, Roland began to laugh his odd laugh, and it sounded so odd even to him that it woke him from his reverie. Roland suddenly began to scream. He realized he was going at over 100 miles an hour and in the wrong direction. The reason he was feeling better with each passing mile was that he was a mile further away from the confrontation he claimed he was not afraid of facing. He saw through his obvious defensiveness for the first time. Regression, the way you were when you were hurt. Sometimes even more debilitating than the returning feeling is the sudden displacement in time you feel as you are transported to the moment when the old hurt took place. You feel like a child again, helpless, frightened, and overwhelmed. You are remembering not only what happened to you, but what you were like at the time. Since you were probably less able to defend yourself then, you feel more vulnerable and have a greater need to be defensive. This explains why when some people are triggered in this way, they become rigid and frozen as if expecting the worst. In a toxic nostalgic episode, you feel as if you have been transported back to the time when the triggered old injury originally occurred. You tend to see the world not as your mature self, but as the person you were then, someone who lacks your present experience and wisdom. In spite of knowing better, you tend to act childishly, reveal your character flaws, become needy, controlling, or impulsive. You're certainly not at your best, and your performance feels obligatory, not a matter of choice. You are acting from weakness and doubt. Even though you're pretty sure you're no longer this way, you begin to wonder. Such regressions can be deeply demoralizing and difficult to put in perspective because it is your perspective itself that is compromised when you regress. What complicates the matter further is that the perspective that you regress to may be much more childish than the feeling that is triggered, and therefore even more difficult to place. The following case illustrates this point. When Doris's boyfriend impulsively broke off their engagement, she panicked and developed severe stomach cramps that put her to bed for days, unable to hold food down. Her roommate was unable to reassure her. Doris talked about how this always seemed to happen to her. She began to obsess about a boyfriend who had rejected her when she was in high school, as if it had just happened. Doris became infantile and helpless. The two rejections seemed to combine to torment her, but neither could fully explain her severe regression. She became negative and whined and became so unwilling to accept her roommate's helpful suggestions that the roommate finally went away for the weekend in disgust, leaving Doris to solve her problems by herself. All alone in the apartment, Doris began to remember being abandoned by her mother after her father died in an automobile crash when she was 5. Mother had never gotten along with Doris's father, and after his sudden death, Mother began to date compulsively, often leaving Doris alone without a babysitter. Doris was close to her father and saw Mother's actions as a betrayal both of herself and of Father. Fearing punishment if she cried, Doris held her mourning inside. Over the years, it evolved into a yearning for a man to replace her father and a tendency to expect more in relationships than was realistic. This in turn led her to act needy and to possess the men she loved, causing them to push her away, thus creating the very abandonment Doris feared facing but still had to work through. When her boyfriend rejected her, Doris remembered the state of abandonment she experienced after her father died. She attached this point of view to the memory of losing her high school boyfriend, the first person she ever risked depending on after her father died. The isolation Doris felt when her roommate left intensified Doris's feeling of abandonment and allowed her to remember her older state of mind. In the middle of her pain, Doris realized that although she was sad over both her boyfriend's rejection and remembering her teenage relationship going sour, it was recalling how powerless she felt after losing her father that had cut so deep. Once she realized the source of her regressed perspective, Doris was able to talk about missing her father and her anger at her mother for the first time. Guilt, the emotional debt to be released. It's a rare person who cannot relate to the following. Someone hurts you in a way that feels vaguely familiar. But before you begin to express yourself, you're caught in a confusing web of doubt that stymies you. Instead of having the courage to speak up, you feel unworthy. Even though the other person is clearly at fault and the hurt unprovoked, you question whether you did something to deserve it. Your mind considers the possibilities. Perhaps you did something to offend the other person. Perhaps you're really a bad person and the other person senses it. In your heart, you know this reasoning is not true, and yet these guilty thoughts resonate within you. Your self-doubt keeps you from defending yourself. Part of your response can be understood as a downloading of old guilt from emotional debt. There's always some guilt accompanying a triggered emotional episode. These old feelings of unworthiness lead you to react incorrectly to the events of the present. Since you doubt yourself, you do not speak up for your present hurt, but withdraw instead. This keeps you from resolving the present problem and ensures that the original problem stays hidden. These feelings of guilt can also lead you to overreact defensively to the present by protesting too much. For some people, the emergence of this old guilt at the time they are hurt precipitates an emotional decompensation, just as it did when Richard saw presents fall from his grandson's piñata, reminding him of his old anger over being deprived. Instead of being able to use the toxic nostalgic event as a second chance to resolve the old guilt, Richard took the reappearance of old guilt as a confirmation that he was bad. It feels unfair that you should be punished from within and without at the same time, but that is the essence of toxic nostalgia. As uncomfortable as these intrusive feelings are, they are all part of the natural healing process. They reappear because they still need to be resolved. Their return should be seen as an opportunity to heal. Welcome these feelings into your life and allow yourself to experience them. Here are some guiding thoughts. Put aside your self-doubt. Resist getting lost in your emotions. Try to learn from them. Take some distance. What is the feeling you are feeling? What does the feeling mean? If it is anxiety, what loss looms? If it is hurt, seek the cause. If it is anger, seek the hurt. Accept that the feeling has some truth in it. Try to remember when you first felt this way. Ask yourself, how was I hurt before? What feelings did I conceal at that time? Why? What did I fear? With whom do I still need to make peace? The recollection of healing, the path to resolution. When an incompletely mourned pain is triggered into awareness, it not only brings with it the original context of the hurt and the old guilt, but also some of your acceptance, the healing perspective. Some part of the old pain has been processed. Reminding yourself that you have gotten through much of this pain before and have found some peace can give you the strength to face the part you have not mourned. Unfortunately, when a negative feeling is triggered, the part that is most prominent is the unresolved part, the part that still hurts. It generally gets all of your attention and makes you lose your sense of well-being. While much of what you feel seems raw, you need to remind yourself that you have also settled some of the pain as well. You don't have to go through all of it again to find peace. Remember, even if it still hurts, you're better now than you were. For example, when settling a loved one's residual affairs a year after his death, you experience great sadness. In some way, the loss seems even more real, because after all this time, all of your wishing and yearning have still proven fruitless. The loss still stands. Even so, you have surely mourned some part of the loss before, and that mourning has not been wasted. While you may be unhappy going through your loved one's belongings and settling the estate, it is not as painful as it was some months earlier. Sadness gradually replaces the shock as the healed part of the loss is brought forward with it. You need to remember that the healing has been accomplished and allow it to reassure you. You're better now. While many toxic nostalgic manifestations are precipitated feeling states, others manifest as illogical behavior or unproductive attitudes that are held over a long time, such as prejudices, false beliefs, self-destructive living, and work patterns. As many of the following examples will show, these confusing, painful episodes create a powerful momentum to heal. Repetitive relationship problems are seldom about the issues that are on the surface. Some relationships can be a toxic nostalgic experience all by themselves. Although at the age of 23, Paul was the top luxury automobile salesman for the dealership, he needed constant adulation. He lived with Michelle, who lived in fear of abandonment. To control Paul, Michelle focused all her energy on him, making him feel as if he were the center of her world. While the attention felt wonderful at first, Michelle soon became jealous and suspicious. She accused Paul of wanting sex with every woman he looked at. She even became jealous of his male friends and would drop into the dealership unannounced and become jealous when he talked to customers. Paul's father divorced his mother when he was 4. His mother could not bear feeling abandoned and cast Paul in the role of her little husband. When Paul became an adolescent, his hurt over being controlled was unbearable. He tried to break away but was thwarted by his mother, who made him feel guilty by demanding to know how he could be so unappreciative of all that she had sacrificed on his behalf. His buried anger caused his self-esteem to deteriorate. Paul found himself highly susceptible to Michelle's smothering behavior because it reminded him of the way his mother controlled him. Michelle also punished him by entrapping him. This seemed to neutralize his hidden anger. 2 days after he broke up with Michelle, Paul found himself attracted to a woman just because she showered him with intense attention, which made him feel like the center of the world again. Within a week, she moved in with him, except this time, Paul began to feel anxious as his new girlfriend immediately started to follow him from room to room. He found himself blowing up at her for clinging to him and suddenly realized that he had chosen 2 identically difficult women in a row. Although the situation felt familiar, he could not imagine what would lead him to do something like this. Paul was stunned when it was pointed out that he really wasn't interested in either woman, but was still angry at his mother and needed someone to punish him the way she used to. When he realized that it was possible to feel angry and still be a good person, Paul was finally able to forgive his mother and break his repetitive cycle. Whenever Joanna was verbally and physically abused by her husband, instead of becoming angry, she became powerless, overwhelmed with feelings of self-hatred and hopelessness. She would regress to the way she used to think when she was an adolescent and concluded that she instigated the abuse and deserved to be treated this way. In telling her story, Joanna realized that she first felt this way when she was sexually abused by her brother. She had tried to get help from her parents then, but they did not believe her and punished her instead for even suggesting such a thing. Although she did not want to stay married, Joanna found herself mired in familiar feelings of discomfort. The abuse felt so much like something she felt accustomed to that she thought it would be wrong to take her husband to court. She feared she was the one who would be declared at fault because her pent-up anger might leak out and show everyone she was not a good person. A common theme in toxic nostalgia, perhaps, but also the source of the shame of the incest survivor. One day, Joanna's husband threatened her with a knife. She became faint, but found a reservoir of strength, stood her ground for the first time, picked up her child, and ran out of the house to start a life of her own. Some months following her separation, Joanna went on a camping trip with some old friends she hadn't seen since her youth. Unfortunately, they told her how to dress, when to get up, and criticized her for wanting to spend time by herself. The second morning of the trip, Joanna awoke after a night of troublesome dreams, feeling transported to childhood. Reasoning that she had no clothes to wear to school and was afraid of being laughed at, she found it impossible to get out of her sleeping bag. The abuse of Joanna's friends caused her old attitude of hopelessness and powerlessness along with her old point of view. The more emotion that is stored, the easier it is spilled. Because Joanna had lived a life of secrecy and concealed her hurt, she felt somehow in collusion with her abusers. This made it difficult to defend herself and allowed her to tolerate abusiveness. Since Joanna suffered years of abuse from many sources and kept it from expression, she was susceptible to experiencing multiple episodes of toxic nostalgia. Joanna was brimming with so much hurt that her suppressed rage could be triggered by any abusive event. At the same time, her old defenses would be activated and redirect her anger inside, causing her to believe she deserved to be hurt and the cycle would continue. Fortunately, learning to fight one battle gave Joanna the courage to correct other wrongs. As she lay in the sleeping bag with her friends barking orders, Joanna remembered how brave she had been when her husband had threatened her with the knife. It gave her courage. To her friend's surprise, she got up, packed her camping gear, and walked out of the forest. Little by little, Joanna began to substitute a pattern of assertion in the place of her automatic victim response. The healing process gathers momentum from each success. An irrational obligation almost always is a cover for concealed guilt. He wanted to be less connected to Emily, his 22-year-old daughter, now that she had left home and was married. However, he felt compelled to send her money and acted overprotective whenever he was with her. He knew something was wrong, but couldn't place the feeling. Jim took custody of Emily, his only daughter, when she was 14. His wife had lost custody because her new husband had molested Emily. At the time Emily moved in, Jim was living alone with few social contacts. Because Emily had not grown up in his house, Jim did not expect her to be so grown up. Unsure of what a father should do, Emily became his companion. They went to the movies, out to dinner, and hiked in the woods together. Emily was Jim's only female companion since he divorced. Jim felt a powerful obligation to be protective of Emily. That was only in part a response to the fact that she had been molested. Although he could not identify them clearly, Jim also had some sexual feelings towards Emily, which he had never experienced before. He set the frightening feelings aside and concentrated on protecting Emily from ardent suitors without ever realizing that he was really a little worried about his own interest in her. As Emily grew into a woman and left his house, those unrecognized feelings remained in place, and with them feelings of shame and discomfort, which prompted him to feel overprotective. It was pointed out that Jim's feelings were not uncommon. It was suggested that had he friends to confide in, he would have realized he was not abnormal to have such feelings and would have quickly dismissed his fear that he might be molested like his wife's husband. When this was explained, Jim's anxiety faded, and with it his need to be overly protective. Always ask what you are making up for by fulfilling the irrational obligation. What is the hidden fear? Sometimes a pattern of abusive behavior becomes established as a toxic nostalgic response. Felice was afraid that her unsuccessful attempts to manage her 16-year-old daughter would cause her to leave, something she greatly feared. Felice restricted her daughter severely, refusing to allow her to leave the house after school or visit friends even at reasonable times. The daughter was an excellent student, had never been any kind of a problem, until, wanting to be like the other girls, she began to resist mother's unreasonable demands. Felice was in a panic, knowing that her requests were unreasonable and that it was her daughter's task to grow independent and eventually leave. But she could not understand what drove her to be so controlling. Felice revealed without the slightest hesitation that she was the youngest of 6 children, and, as was customary in her culture, her mother insisted that she not marry, but stay home and take care of her. When asked how she felt about that arrangement, Felice admitted that she didn't like it, but had played the role of the obedient daughter and had to struggle to leave home. Then, to her complete surprise, Felice just blurted that she hated her mother for abusing, beating, and controlling her. When it was pointed out that Felice was treating her daughter the same way her mother had treated her, she gave an audible gasp of disbelief. As obvious as her motivations were for controlling her daughter, Felice had never made the connection. Felice realized that her daughter was expressing the very feelings she had wished to share with her mother and was making the rebellion she wished she'd started. The daughter's protest became doubly fearful for Felice because she was still trying to suppress her old rebellion. Felice had always wanted her mother's power, and when she finally became a mother, she claimed it. When Felice's own inhibited adolescent rebellion was brought to the surface by her daughter's defiance, she felt she not only had to control her daughter, but herself as well. The event that triggered Felice into acting like her mother was very subtle. Her daughter reached the age when Felice was first abused, and Felice identified with her. The victim of abuse, by victimizing someone in the way he was abused, becomes an abuser as a way of symbolically ridding himself of his old hurt and anger. Unfortunately, the plan is flawed, creates more guilt, and another generation of abusers. Sometimes a toxic nostalgic event is characterized by the sudden intrusion of defenses that leads to an absence of emotions where one would expect to have intense feelings. The blocking of an emotion is not as dramatic as the abrupt appearance of a triggered emotional state, and yet it can be every bit as painful. When a veil of indifference descends between you and those you love, you feel separated and adrift. The blocking of your feelings impoverishes your entire world. Sharon was a 60-year-old fashion designer who complained that she was no longer able to show affection. Although she loved her 2 grandchildren and got along well with her daughter, not to feel love for them made her so uncomfortable that she made excuses not to visit. She knew she loved them, but her belief did not feel attached to any inner feelings of love. The disconnection made her feel spacey and intensely anxious. When asked if there was anyone she didn't have difficulty expressing feelings of love to, Sharon immediately responded, "My husband." He had died a few years before. Sharon continued, "When he got sick, I suddenly felt I had to be strong for the whole family. It was my duty. I felt I had to set aside my negative feelings and act as if everything was going to be okay." Having been told that her husband had terminal cancer and would not survive the year, this was a brave face indeed. In spite of knowing the truth, Sharon assumed the posture of pretending and maintained it with total conviction. She was so successful in blocking her feelings that she was unable to cry at the funeral. Ironically, everyone felt she was magnificent. Sharon gradually felt herself becoming more distant from people. She felt she was a stranger locked inside her own body as she observed her affection for others fade. The birth of her first grandchild just 6 weeks after the funeral posed a threat to her. Sharon was aware that she loved her granddaughter and wished to express it, but the risk of opening herself up made her anxious, and so she backed away. Her daughter assumed that this was a delayed reaction to the death of her father, but did not mention it to her. When a year later her grandson was born, Sharon's daughter began to ask why she didn't want to spend time with him. However, as soon as Sharon allowed herself to feel her positive feelings, the hurt she blocked began to return. These raw, unprocessed negative feelings frightened Sharon. She immediately closed down again and distanced the world. Her discomfort over feeling nothing finally became the force that motivated her to seek help. Sharon didn't give her relationship with her husband the dignity of her tears, and so his death had no closure. Any expression of feelings frightened her because it symbolized becoming open, challenging her pretense of being strong, and dealing with her unexpressed grief. It could be argued that any person with a predominant character type is already displaying toxic nostalgia, which is sometimes more apparent than others. In fact, the sudden intensification of a character flaw is probably the most common form of toxic nostalgia. Everyone has the potential for such a negative display of weakness. It is the purpose of the natural therapeutic process to bring you to admit the buried hurts that trouble you. Only then can you lower the negative energy which predisposes you to bring out your worst. When you suffer a disappointment, especially when you are overloaded with fatigue and stress, it's common to revert to an old defensive attitude, behavior pattern, attitude, or rigid style of responding. Your reaction may feel childish and a bit prefabricated, like a button has been pressed. You don't feel that your true self is responding. The main reason behind this reaction is usually your wish to avoid taking responsibility for your feelings and situation. What follows are some typical characterological toxic nostalgic responses. With the dependent response, you suddenly feel like a helpless child, betrayed and abused by everyone and everything. You parade your injury, displaying how you've been wronged. You give a full recital of the abuses done to you and tell the story of how insult was added to injury, how heartless and cruel others acted. You parade your innocence, how defenseless, pure, trusting, giving, believing, and kind you were. You appeal to the world, crying, "Look at the damage that was done to me." All this is done to appeal to others to join you in blaming your abuses and to make allowances for why you haven't grown up, are still being needy, haven't succeeded, overcome adversity, and haven't done any better. Poor thing. The lesson you need to learn: it's still your fault that your life has turned out the way it has, your complaints about others notwithstanding. With the controlling response, you are instantly transformed into a self-righteous, arrogant know-it-all. You have caught the other party red-handed. You declare that you will never forgive or forget what has happened. You make a detailed list of the charges against the other person. You rehearse your argument. You feel totally justified in assuming a punitive, withholding attitude. You alienate even more people when you do, and you blame them for withdrawing from you. The lesson you need to learn: regardless of your ability to disprove this, it was your fault that the situation turned out the way it did. If subordinates failed you, you should have known better than to hire them in the first place or to delegate responsibility to them. The question you should ask is not why did they fail, but why didn't you know they weren't capable? It's your responsibility. Focus on what you did wrong, not how others reacted. You need to risk showing your humanness and your flaws. The competitive response says, "I'll show them. It didn't matter. I wasn't really hurt. You're confusing me with someone who gives a damn." You declare your indifference a little too arrogantly. You protest your immunity with too much force. It's obvious to everyone that you really do care and have been crushed by your failure or rejection and are just trying to save face. However, instead of acting in a way that is honest and vulnerable, you act as if you don't care. This causes others to mistrust you. If you act like you don't care when you lose something that once seemed important to you, others wonder how much you could care about them. By acting full of pretense, you've demonstrated that it is possible for you to appear as self-important a loser as a winner. The lesson you need to learn: the people who love you because you're human, not because you're perfect. They love you most because you're vulnerable. They respect your successes more when they know how frightened you were when you risked, and how brave you were to overcome such deep self-doubt, for that is what a hero is made of. Trying to pass off your accomplishments as if they were easy and your failures as if they were trivial may have been the way you tried to impress people when you were young, but people respect you now for your real talents, for your effort, for your persistence and reliability. The show is over in a flash. What remains is what is real. Your most important lessons come by being honest about your failures. Whenever a physical organ becomes the expressive pathway for an unresolved emotional problem, it is also an example of toxic nostalgia. The examples are familiar and include cardiovascular disease, gastrointestinal problems, hormonal dysfunction, and skin disease, to mention a few. It is common knowledge that stress creates muscle tenseness and anger causes headaches. One of the most important parts of any treatment for high blood pressure or angina is learning how to relax. Often the illnesses that are precipitated by unexpressed emotions become chronic, and when the emotional origins of the symptoms are clouded by time, these illnesses seem especially mysterious and puzzling. The problem is further complicated because the physical symptoms create more stress, which in turn creates more symptoms. Unfortunately, even in enlightened times like today, treatment is often directed at relieving the physical symptoms and not at trying to understand the underlying emotional dynamics. Any inhibited emotion can find its expression as a somatic symptom. Annie was a 16-year-old girl who developed severe sinusitis which was unresponsive to treatment. The only findings were some redness and swelling of her nasal passages. Antibiotics and sprays had no effect. After seeing a team of experts, Annie still complained she couldn't breathe. A sweet girl who had never been a problem before, Annie began to become disruptive in school by suddenly getting up and running out of the classroom. When questioned about her behavior, she would become hostile and sullen. To her parents' dismay, Annie also started to hang around with some tough girls. The problem was obvious, but no one asked Annie what she was afraid of. It turned out that "I can't breathe" meant "I'm afraid of suffocating." During the 1994 Los Angeles earthquake, all of the contents of her bookshelves fell down onto her bed, along with a large section of plaster which crumbled in a choking cloud of dust. In the 30 seconds of violent movement, Annie had the feeling that she was going to be buried alive. In the months following the earthquake, a period of time punctuated by many disturbing aftershocks, Annie adopted a child's perspective and refused to sleep in her room. Instead, she slept in the hall outside her parents' bedroom, believing that being closer to her parents was safer. There was some logic to her choice because the hall was also closer to the front door, a possible escape. Annie was afraid to talk about her feelings because she feared that people would think she was a sissy. This increased the anxiety she stored in emotional debt, which made her increasingly vigilant. Each new aftershock reinforced her fears that she would be buried in debris and would suffocate. It was Annie's refusal to admit she was afraid that caused her problems. She didn't think it was cool to be afraid and hid her fear from her parents and from her schoolmates. She made friends with the tougher girls to help give the impression she was tough, but the fears she tried to repress kept intruding. Although Annie's behavior was obvious, it wasn't noticed because other family members were also denying their anxiety, being brave as they tried to get their lives back in order. Since Annie's room actually suffered minimal damage compared to the rest of the house, she was told she was lucky and that she should feel thankful instead of afraid. The only acceptable way she could talk about her feelings without losing face was to complain about her inability to breathe. When she admitted she was afraid of being smothered, her sinusitis cleared virtually overnight. Sometimes you have a suspicion that there are emotional causes to your physical symptoms without even being sure how it all fits together. Laura was a 55-year-old woman just starting menopause and embarrassed by her moodiness. She developed painful skin eruptions of shingles on her back and chest and wondered if these were psychological in origin because the symptoms developed shortly after a stressful meeting. Laura was a strong and loyal worker in a company in which Byzantine power struggles constantly roiled and threatened stability. During a meeting with her supervisor, who was jealous of Laura and wished to install her own younger friend in Laura's position, the supervisor noticed that Laura was having a hot flash and pointedly asked Laura if she were hot. Then, pushing bad taste to the extreme, she went around the table, polling the other people in the meeting one by one if they felt warm. Laura was understandably humiliated, but because of the supposedly professional nature of the situation, she was unable to defend herself. Instead, she internalized her anger, and as a result, her self-esteem plummeted. Laura felt her rage burning inside and felt powerless and worthless. Shortly after this was when she developed her skin problem. There were several factors that contributed to Laura's emotional debt. Her father died before she was 4. He was a powerful, controlling person who convinced Mother never to remarry. Mother was cold and repressive and unable to tell Laura she loved her. Laura grew up in an atmosphere that forbade her to express her pain of rejection. Laura grew up angry but didn't know why and struggled to conceal it. She developed a deep hunger for love and affection from an older woman, believing that if she could find that love, she would be happy. When her supervisor humiliated her, Laura's forbidden anger at her mother was reawakened and joined forces with her anger at her supervisor. Stunned by the volume of the response, Laura became convinced she was bad and had always been, and therefore had never been deserving, justifying Mother's withholding. Laura's need to suffer, to atone and make herself lovable again, coincided with the outbreak of shingles. Laura had to learn that being angry didn't make her bad or make her deserve to suffer. Repetitive destructive relationships are often indicators of toxic nostalgia. People who end up in abusive or alcoholic relationships are often acting out some earlier unresolved life situation. The relationship is difficult to correct because it is not a relationship in its own right, but a projective opportunity in which to replay the dynamics of the past. Many such relationships are therefore not amenable to treatment. Unfortunately, they not infrequently come to the attention of the marriage counselor, many of whom have limited experience in understanding the powerful binding effects of these earlier dynamics and the way they contribute to the forming of an outwardly stable but deeply troubled union. To heal such relationships, each partner must deal with his troubled past. This is a formidable task involving forgotten issues and remote emotional debt that shape character type. Not easy to do for one person, let alone a couple. Sometimes the only way to resolve these relationships, which are often thinly concealed attempts to re-experience an inaccessible, painful past, is to end them. A great majority of them do end by themselves. However, the partners often seek out another partner exactly like the one they have left. They now continue to live out the unresolved dynamics of their early years without ever facing what is truly motivating them. It is only when a person accepts responsibility for himself that such a repetitive pattern can be broken. It usually takes a monumental loss in which denial is rendered useless for this awakening to take place. Other behavior patterns that can signal toxic nostalgia include compulsive eating, drinking, gambling, and compulsive sexual activity. Whereas obsessional thinking is a reflection of internalized anger that has been directed at the self and is manifest as guilt, compulsive behavior is the self-destructive acting out of these guilty feelings. The damage done by the compulsive behavior is a form of self-punishment designed to alleviate the guilt. However, it only creates more problems. Recovery from these compulsive behavior patterns requires that you take responsibility for the feelings of the moment, accept yourself just as you are, focus on what you can do about your life in this place with what you have, and manage your life moment to moment without looking back on the past to justify failing or self-destructiveness. Alcohol interferes with the healing mechanism in the most sardonic way. While it makes the alcoholic exquisitely susceptible to toxic nostalgic recall, it also disables him. Although his emotions are easily triggered, he cannot integrate them or put them to therapeutic benefit. It all sounds vaguely familiar to Shakespeare's Night Watchman in Macbeth, expounding on the effects of drink on sexual ability. It provokes the desire, but it takes away the performance. Alcohol awakens memory, but blocks healing. In a sense, the alcoholic lives in a toxic, nostalgic world. He is full of regretful recall, self-pity, unresolved hurt, and anger. The slightest negative stimulus provokes gales of overstated affect and scenes of high drama. An innocent criticism unlocks his mind's filing cabinet of evidence, proving he is bad. The best intentions of caring others are defeated by his shame and repressed anger. All the richness of emotions that are brought forth by the bottle might just as well be bottled themselves for all the good they are allowed to do. Alcohol has powerful anti-anxiety properties. It defeats the part of the brain that senses unacceptable thoughts and feelings, permitting them to surface in the intoxicated state. However, at the same time, alcohol seems to block feelings by generally depressing all brain functions. The emotions that are blocked rankle and build. When the drinking subsides, these feelings press forward again with renewed strength. It requires increasing amounts of alcohol to inhibit the constant runoff of unwanted emotions, thus the predisposition for dependency and addiction and for repeating toxic nostalgic episodes. Another opportunity to heal. The light of the truth continually exposes unresolved feelings to resolution. It is the mixing of past and present that dismays you. The chagrin over realizing that ghosts of old feelings still haunt your consciousness and have the power to intrude at will is a disquieting thought. No one likes to believe that something is amiss and not be able to identify and fix it. Repairing the old damage done to you is not merely a matter of resolving to be better, but a result of a willingness to be vulnerable, to accept that you are not perfect, to admit that what you have lost has mattered to you, and to take responsibility for the way your life has turned out. Lowering your defenses is a key factor in the resolution of the complex array of emotional factors that predispose you to toxic nostalgia. Letting go of the hurt you have stored in emotional debt is the necessary healing step. Releasing hurt is the central act of forgiving. You release others to be released yourself. This is not possible unless you're willing to admit that you have been hurt. This is not possible unless you are willing to change and grow, to admit your weaknesses and accept them as part of yourself. Your ease in accepting yourself determines how easily you deal with the pain of your life and the hurt of the moment. You cannot be free in the moment if you are guarding against realizations that wish to speak to you from your past. What are those old realizations? They are many. You were hurt, abandoned, cheated, injured, abused, and betrayed. You were not loved the way you wanted to be loved, or the way you needed to be loved. You were not cherished for the person you are. You compromised. You gave in to the belief that you were less. You took the easy path, betraying yourself and your gift. You held grudges, acted in anger, sought revenge, and in denying your hurt, you allowed your anger to grow out of control and sometimes hurt others in the very way you were hurt, the very thing you promised yourself you would never do. You became the enemy you hated most. Your sudden recollections of unresolved pain are another opportunity to correct these imbalances. You can never go back and relive the past. Accept that. You can never make someone who does not already love you. Accept that as well. You have no power over others, barely control over the events in your own life. You need to let go of others and release them to their own destiny and you to yours. You cannot win the esteem of the world, please everyone, or win every time. You need to reach for your own stars and find victory on your own terms. The purpose of dealing with so many painful issues and negative feelings is not to get you depressed, but by guiding you through the depths of human suffering to allow you to become familiar with sadness so that dealing with grief is not strange to you. Embracing the good of life is not possible unless you have found a way to come to terms with the truth. Toxic nostalgia, though unpleasant and unpredictable, is an optimistic reminder that healing is still possible and a better and happier you is still evolving. Be patient and trust in the natural therapeutic process. It is the heart of your being and the key to your happiness and self-acceptance. Toxic nostalgia is the wake-up call of the soul. The do's and don'ts of natural therapy. Do. Tell the truth. Face life openly. What you avoid imprisons you. Say what you mean, feel, and believe. Accept yourself as you are. Accept others as they are as well. Know and admit your weaknesses. Stop trying to prove yourself. Let go of the past. Give up your false expectations. Take responsibility for your life and how it turned out. What you are willing to take responsibility for frees you. Have a dream for a better life and commit to it. Be kind to yourself every day. Find something to be grateful for and remember it. Forgive. Here are the don'ts of natural therapy. Don't try, just be. Don't lie. Don't try to change or fix others. Don't try to control others. Don't expect the person who hurt you to apologize. Don't expect people to be nicer to you than they are to themselves. Don't expect others to recognize your goodness or accomplishment. Don't expect people to understand you. Don't test others. Don't blame others. Don't hold a grudge. Don't expect the world to be anything but the way it is right now. Don't wait for permission to do what is best for you. Peace of mind comes with self-acceptance. It is not conferred by achievement, even though you may feel driven to succeed. Peace of mind is the gift you give to yourself. You need to place your life in balance, the good with the bad, your strengths with your weaknesses, and your hurt with your pleasure. Life is a continual process of reconciling the past with the present. The object is for you to become as openly conversant with history as possible, so you are able to enjoy the moment without fearing the intrusion of the past. Permit the natural healing process to have its way with you. Feel your present hurts and complete them. Be grateful for the healing opportunities that toxic nostalgia presents to you to resolve your past pain.